and preferences, but the city has a long way to go. Discrimination, the lack of available housing, and the dearth of low-cost and affordable rental housing all deny New Yorkers the choice in where they live. HPD was a primary architect of the city's Where We Live NYC plan. Where We Live is an unprecedented and comprehensive set of commitments to undo New York City's legacy of discriminatory housing practices and replace it with justice and equity for those who make New York City their home. The plan was completed at a moment when the federal government was backing away from its commitment to the Federal Fair Housing Act. 5 years on from its release, Where We Live is recognized as a landmark. It continued to hold strength through both the pandemic and an administration change, and it was an inspiration for the historic citywide zoning reform, which you know, City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. Just to create Where We Live, HPD and its partners spent countless hours examining data, holding community conversations with more than 700 New Yorkers, and considering exclusionary housing practices from every angle. We heard from New Yorkers that their experiences around segregation and integration are complicated, but above all else, we took from those interactions the message that New Yorkers need choice in where they live. As part of Where We Live, we looked at multiple approaches to understanding the city's residential patterns and how those patterns have changed since 1990. Taken together, the data show that the city is increasingly diverse, yet still segregated by race and ethnicity by most measures. And I know we have some visuals up on the screen that demonstrate this reality. We also identified that life outcomes based on race, disability status, and other characteristics protected by fair housing laws correlate strongly with the city's patterns of segregation. Asthma rates in the predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods of Mott Haven and Melrose, for example, were outsized compared to those from lower density, more affluent and white parts of Queens and even parts of Manhattan. Similarly, in neighborhoods with the highest ratios of pawn shops and check cashers to banks and credit unions, all areas with predominant populations of people of color, most neighborhood residents had subprime or unscorable credit. Taken as a whole, the data in Where We Live reveals that the neighborhoods we call home affect our access to essential services, including affordable transportation, quality education, safe streets, and various goods and services that enhance our well-being. And you can see the visual about the asthma rates and the credit mats. Undoing the city's legacy of segregation requires various interventions and investments. We must address the uneven distribution of housing production, especially the production of low-cost housing, so that New Yorkers can choose to live in the neighborhoods that are best for them. Currently, however, new housing production is highly concentrated. In recent years, some neighborhoods have added virtually zero housing, and some are even losing homes. Specifically in 2023, 10 community districts produced as much as the other 49 community districts combined, a factor that contributes to the existence of limited affordability areas. Now, limited affordability areas are neighborhoods that fall below the 30th percentile citywide in terms of the number of homes that would be affordable to the median income New Yorker. Because of the lack of low-cost housing, low-income New Yorkers cannot choose to move to limited affordability areas and are effectively excluded from these communities. And you'll see up on the board our housing production map and the limited affordability area map. HPD is working to make sure that there is more housing, especially low-cost and affordable, in every neighborhood. Since the release of Where We Live in October 2020, we incorporated into our principles and our work to make good on the Where We Live commitments. HPD and its partner agencies have met 50% of the planned commitments, with over 90% in progress toward completion. But HPD cannot truly unlock the power of housing development toward a more equitable and just New York alone. Key to our progress and to greater housing equity are the zoning practices and policies that make it possible to develop affordable housing in all neighborhoods. In addition to the commitments the city has made as part of where we live, and consistent with the spirit of those commitments, Local Law 167 of 2023 requires the city to set community district housing production targets and to conduct an assessment of unique community housing needs. To meet those targets, the city will need more tools to dismantle the obstacles to fair housing that have existed for generations. HPD has continued to sound an alarm. Barriers to housing and neighborhood choice are not just part of our city's history, they are a deeply unfortunate part of its present. And there is a version of the future in which we allow policies of discrimination and exclusion to persist. The watchword from HPD's perspective is choice. The choice that all New Yorkers should have to live in the types of buildings, neighborhoods, and communities that suit their needs, the needs of their families, their health, and identities. HPD views choice as our commitment to New Yorkers, and we believe it is our obligation to raise awareness of this commitment at every chance. We hope that the Commission shares this commitment in its deliberations and that the changes to the Charter reflect it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today, and to all of you, thank you for your service to the City of New York as part of this Commission. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Anyone have any questions? Commissioner Westbrook?
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Will the department be submitting any recommendations to the Commission on proposed charter changes that would make the challenge of where we live more achievable?
So we are part of a robust discussion around some of the proposals that are being talked about. Lucy can talk a little bit about the work we're doing in that regard. I think what we want to do is to frame the challenge that we're facing, what's before you, and to let you know that the obstacles are real, and that this commission has the opportunity to address those obstacles in its deliberations.
We're here in our expert capacity around fair housing. We also do extensive data work, and we're here to be a resource for the commission.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of what you said.
We're here to be a resource for the commission and to provide insight or information that you may need.
It would, at least from my perspective, since you are really, in many respects, the deliverer of housing for the city, any recommendations that you might have that would, for charter change that would make your job and the challenges of where we live more easily achievable would be, at least from my perspective, very welcome.
So we appreciate that.
You don't have to answer that now, I'm just, but as we deliberate, it would be helpful.
Yes, and we look forward to continuing to be a resource on that, and we can certainly talk more about any of the proposals as we go, and some of our perspective and what we've seen as the challenges for building housing in all parts of the city, which is really a lot of our focus.
And I'll just add very briefly that some of the legislative wins that we've had recently have moved some of those obstacles out of the way. And of course, the amendments that we made to the zoning code through City of Yes for housing opportunity really created a fertile environment for us to be able to build in many of the places where these problems persisted because the zoning code just didn't allow multifamily rental housing in many places. Some of the incentives that are built into that, I think, are going to show results over the next 10 to 15 years. And you've heard the estimate, it's about 82,000 units of additional housing that will be coming onto the market. And I'll add this, affordable housing production is a small slice of the housing in New York City. And regulated housing is a small slice. You know, there's more than 3.5 million, 3.6 million homes out there. And the regulated universe is about 1 million units or just shy of 1 million units. We want to put more of those regulated units in the market to create opportunity, but we also have a severe supply problem in this town. And if, you know, changing the zoning code has allowed us to create a larger envelope of opportunity.
Thank you. Commissioner Nieves? You press the button.
Red is on, okay. That's all right. Hi, Commissioner. Good to see you. The question that I have for you is we've seen a lot of studies that say because we have such a low vacancy rate, it doesn't matter what kind of housing we put out there. If we just increase the volume of housing out there, we will lower rates and thus increase mobility. Now, there are critics of that. And I really hope that you could respond to that now, but I really hope in your testimony or whatever you submit that you really speak to that theory, which is broadly held, flood the market, prices will go down, and mobility will increase for folks. So I hope that you can, if you want to say something now, that would be great, but also I would love to see some written testimony on that as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will say this, that the more housing we have, the better it is. We have a 1.4% vacancy rate, and if you're a low-income family in this town, it's probably under 1%, the availability of affordable units, you know, available to you or your family. So supply in general, we believe that it's good. Our charge is to create more affordable housing for working people and lower income folks, and even folks with no income. And we cover that universe of households, and it's our responsibility as the housing agency of the city of New York. But I'm glad you brought that point up.
Right, and I just want to make sure that when you respond to that, I think there is broad assumptions around the mobility of all New Yorkers. And you particularly focus on those that have no income or low income. If you could also cite and respond to any reports that talk about the differential mobility experiences. Thank you.
If I can also add on to that question, you hear us talk a lot about affordable housing, and absolutely the commissioner talked about our work around increasing the supply. Something that we also focus on, and it's why we call it Where We Live. Where we build and what we build also matters. And we believe really deeply it is not an either or, it is a both and. So we both need to build as much additional housing as we can, as much of that to be low and low cost and affordable is great. But also there are parts of our city that have long been closed off to many New Yorkers. And that is not a historical accident. It's something we've talked about throughout Where We Live. And government has at times been part of the problem. And at times just stood by. And so a lot of our work, and we think the commission's work to build on what we have set in motion through City of Yes is ensuring that we can actually follow through with that commitment to build a little more housing in every neighborhood across the city, because New Yorkers should be able to choose the neighborhood that's best for them. And if there isn't housing in every single neighborhood, they don't have that choice.
Commissioner Richardson?
Yes, Commissioner, thanks you again for your testimony. I understand that part of HPD's or part of the production of housing comes from housing that is built on formerly city-owned property. I think what would be helpful as a follow-up to understand the mapping of that, and I know that you all have done some great work on looking at not even property that's under HPD's jurisdiction, but could be under other city agency jurisdictions, perhaps looking at what that looks like, and particularly if there are opportunities in those limited affordability areas. I think that'd be interesting.
So, you know, that is probably the freshest stuff that we're doing, the freshest work we're doing. In addition to the zoning code change, there are a number of initiatives where we are looking at assets that can generate significant housing in limited affordability areas. And some of them are in Manhattan. So we've got the Manhattan Plan for 100,000 units of housing over a fixed period of time, identifying every available site where it's possible. Midtown South rezoning, which takes the garment district essentially, and all of this sort of warehouse manufacturing, commercial space, and turns it into housing. Tens of thousands of units of housing available, will become available. And then some major sites that will be offered for proposals for development, including my favorite, which is 100 Gold Street, which will be RFP'd, Shams, which will be put up for proposals within days now, where almost 2,000 units of housing can be created, and it'll be a mix of market rate and deeply affordable to low-income families. It will, and it's in a neighborhood that's rich with opportunity and amenities. So we're very aggressively taking that approach, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
And I'll just add, that is one of the 81 commitments we made in Where We Live, and so this is our work in part to follow up on that.
I want to thank you so much for your testimony. I just want to sort of reiterate what Carl said, is really excited to hear your specific recommendations, not only in your seat now, but you have such a unique set of experiences at every part of this process, as a city councilor, the borough president, HUD, now at HPD. And so much of what we've been hearing about are the different ways in which dynamically each of those levels can affect, for the good or for ill, housing development, including, as you're describing, equitable housing development across the city. So I'm really excited to hear, both from your current seat, but from your life experiences, what you would counsel us to make a charter that would have made this easier at each of the seats you've had.
Well, thank you, and thank you for this opportunity, and we look forward to a robust conversation with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, members.
Appreciate it. Our next speakers will be a panel. I'm going to call out both Marjorie Velasquez, former member of the City Council, and Kirk Goodrich of Monadnock Development. Okay. And I'm sorry, I think I pronounced that wrong. It's Monadnock Development? Okay, sorry about that. Please begin. No, the red button. Red light.
There we go. Good evening. My name is Marjorie Velasquez. And from 2022 to 2023, I served in the City Council representing the 13th District in the Bronx, which includes Straus Neck, Palm Bay Park, Morris Park, and other communities in the Northeast Bronx. The housing crisis is the defining challenge facing our city. As a council member, perhaps one of the challenges I faced the most was when I was in office, was a proposal to build more housing, a rezoning to add 349 apartments in Straus Neck, including 168 affordable apartments for seniors and veterans, in a district that added fewer than 60 affordable units in the previous 8 years. As a council member, under the city council practice known as member deference, you are at the center of the debate over housing proposals like this one. Opponents of a plan, even if they are few, know that the very best way to prevent a project is to convince a council member to vote against it, and they focus their attention on the local member. Simply put, a small vocal minority can get in the way of an affordable housing for majority of residents who so desperately need it. Council members hear the voices of big and small community groups, and during this unprecedented housing crisis, they must strive to provide affordable housing for all families in New York. With member deference, what was originally intended to be an avenue of input for all residents in the district, it's become a bludgeon for a few outspoken residents. They use their wealth and intimidation to unnecessarily divide communities. ULURP member deference will always put elected officials in a position where it's hard to say yes to affordable housing than no, forcing members into a no-win political situation. New Yorkers are tough, and elected officials are used to hearing strong views from constituents. But in my case, the opposition went frighteningly outside the bounds of civil discourse. I was doxxed. I received multiple death threats. My home was broken into. My staff and I had to receive police protection. I had to have a panic button installed in my house and my office that went directly to the NYPD. The hate and the venom laced with racism and misogyny that was directed at me and my staff was overwhelming. I feared for my safety and continue to feel the effects in my community to this day. What did I do to deserve this vitriol? I signaled openness to voting for housing and ultimately negotiated a deal that allowed this important housing project to go forward. Projects like this in every neighborhood are the only way to make a dent in this housing crisis. With how long the ULURP process currently takes, we will struggle to match the rate of affordable housing production that is needed to make New York City an affordable place for families to raise their children and our older New Yorkers to retire in the city they've called home for decades. I am proud of the compromise I negotiated. It took courage, and I understood the stakes. Unfortunately, my decision to support new housing cost me my seat at the City Council. I believe in community input. I believe in a democracy where we need communities to have a say in development. But a system that depends on council members enduring death threats, hate, and intimidation to approve new housing is a system that cannot solve our housing crisis. The City Charter Review Commission gives us an opportunity to address this immense burden that the ULURP process heaves upon local elected officials, and more importantly, would give us an opportunity to turn our dream of affordable housing into a reality. So thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Mr. Goodrich.
Sure. So good evening to all of you, and thank you for the invitation to talk. So my name is Kirk Goodrich. I'm president of Monadnock Development. I've been a developer for the last 15 years. Before that, I financed housing and also studied it as an undergrad, and I'm co-host of the Housing Problem podcast. I think the Charter Revision Commission has an opportunity that's really unique, and my focus, of course, is on reform of the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, ULURP. And I want to echo what former council member Marjorie Velasquez just said, and just applaud her courage and what it cost her. And at a fundamental level, I've spent so much of my time engaging communities, beginning when I was 24, which is now 32 years ago and now. And so no one I know would value community engagement as much as I do. But the last 5 years have been a real eye-opening experience for me. We had 4 rezonings going simultaneously, and the degree of disappointment I have with elected officials and community boards and so-called activists and stakeholders is really problematic. And the reality is that we have a process that doesn't incentivize projects moving quickly, doesn't recognize the pain and suffering working people and poor and vulnerable populations are going through. And, if we take a vacation and we check into a hotel with our family and we don't like it, we get them out of there. We won't even allow our families to spend a single night in a hotel that we don't like. But we're okay in the name of community engagement, having people wait 5, 6, years or longer, some public rezonings 15 years or more, while we deliberate whether affordable housing should be built and how affordable it should be. And I just think that's an abomination. And so we need a fast track disposition, no ULURP disposition for city-owned properties that are for affordable housing. If it's 100% affordable housing, we need an abbreviated process that, in my mind, is built around City Planning Commission approval. And then, as the council member just said, the member deference is a toxic thing. It allows a single individual to disrupt our housing market and creates a situation where affordable housing is concentrated in East New York and Brownsville and the Bronx, and huge swaths of the city don't do their fair share. And I think that's problematic. My audience, whether it was when I was 19 and took my first affordable housing class or today, is the community of working people who are barely scraping by. My mother spent 32 years busting trays in a hospital kitchen with poor working people. And those kinds of people across the United States who are earning minimum wages can't afford to rent a typical one-bedroom in the 50 largest cities in the country. Those people, there's not a city, state, or county in the country where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a typical one-bedroom, a two-bedroom apartment in their market. That's a catastrophe. It's bad housing policy, it's bad social policy, it's bad economic development policy. We have forsaken working people in a catastrophic way in this country. My vision is simple. My parents came here from Belize in 1962. My father was a plumber. My mother worked in a hospital kitchen. They rented a room, then they rented a slightly bigger apartment, and then a bigger apartment, and by 1974, they owned a home. That path is no longer possible. We have a dysfunctional, non-functional housing market, and we have to fix it. And we laugh at communities and suburbs across the United States, but they've figured out something that we've long forgotten. You create a job, you need a housing unit. And I spent, 2 years as an intern in the city of Champaign, Illinois planning department. And when an employer came in with 100 new jobs, they had to figure out where they were going to put 100 households. And we just have given up on that. And we can't, because the lives of working people are at stake. And there are people whose names we don't know, who don't know our names, who need us to wake up every morning and be the best version of ourselves. And they're counting on you folks and folks like us. And we can't let them down and disappoint them like we have the last 20 years. Thank you. I got 9
I
more
want to
seconds.
thank you both for incredibly powerful testimony. And question for you, Councilmember Velasquez. And first of all, again, thank you for your bravery and your leadership. In some ways, I think both of you are describing a central challenge that is coming up, the need to balance the ability of communities to have some say in the direction and development of their communities, particularly in a city where not every community has historically been given voice over the direction of their community, and balancing that against the need to unleash the power and potential that comes from having a supply that is adequate to meet the needs of our city, particularly those who are too often excluded from the economic mainstream. And I'm curious, particularly from your seat, how you would rebalance those issues in the charter. Are there particular recommendations that you would make that would prevent the experience that you went through, but that would also allow local communities to have appropriate voice in how development happens in their neighborhoods?
I've given it a lot of thought, right? Certainly, the power is going back to the community board and having those open conversations. And unfortunately, community boards changing the different faces within the community boards has been historically a situation. Now with the term limits, in community boards, you do have access. So I'd say one recommendation is reviewing that and seeing the effectiveness of that. Do the community boards actively represent the demographics of the community it represents? It's one of them, and working with the local borough presidents and the council members to see how diverse that is, and are we really including all the different voices when we're talking about those community groups? And making community boards more accessible to the local communities. Understanding, educating, and education and awareness of that is the first step, because we have tools, and unfortunately, folks have used these tools that should be engaging with the community as weapons, and as weapons of divisiveness, fear-mongering, and so taking that power away and actually going back into the community and telling them and reminding them of their full power, especially those that have just been left out of the equation because of not being aware of it, and certainly not having time to participate. So meeting folks where they're at, and I think we should really delve into that a little bit better.
Thank you. Start with Commissioner Wild.
So thank you for your testimony, Marjorie and Kirk. And what struck me is what you're describing, Kirk and Adolfo, both in terms of your trajectory. Up through the 1980s, that story was possible. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, and I think that's something we have to think about, that we have to look at what has happened in the last few years. And I think Marjorie sort of nailed it, that the politics have changed dramatically, and we had a charter that worked up through the 1980s to provide this trajectory, and no longer does. And even though we know it's going to be, I mean, I guess my question to you is, do you think it is politically feasible to enact something that reduces a charter provision, that reduces the role of community boards, perhaps flips, and the city council, more importantly? Because I don't think, member deference is a political, not a legal condition. I don't know anything we could do to stop member deference. So I don't think that per se is an option. I think the option has to be changing the process in a way that there's a voice. Some have suggested it's the borough president who can come back in with a voice, or that city planning is the last stop. You sit in certain, so I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
So what I would say is, we're in an emergency situation, and the ability of the executive and leadership of the city to act unilaterally in an emergency, I think is really important. HPD produces these vacancy studies, but if 1.4% vacancy and a situation where 50% of folks are rent burdened is not an emergency. I just think there has to be triggers in other parts of the country that flood regularly. People when far less people are impacted, those communities have the ability to mobilize and house folks. And we need the ability, if certain factors exist, to declare an emergency and have people not go through what we went through in East New York to do 2,000 units of 100% affordable housing, including the dialogue with the council member, was 6 years before we could put a shovel in the ground. That's not acceptable. That's not a victory. There was a panel maybe last year or a couple of years ago on the success of the Gowanus rezoning, and they kind of lost me at 15 years. Like, I mean, the reality is that, right, and the reality is, I have a phrase, and that phrase is, when you love someone or your community or city, you become what they need when they need it. And we fail in both of those counts. Like, when they need it. When your kid is homesick, he needs you right then. He doesn't need you when you get around to it. And the world of philanthropy and government doesn't operate that way. We let people suffer. We let them scramble. We let them be in shelter. We let 100,000 of our kids be in shelter during the course of any year. And none of that moves us to an emergency. People will deliberate forever because fundamentally they want something far less for other families and kids than they want for their own. And that is a huge problem. The only value that's propelled my career, not my skill or anything else, it's I want for everybody else's kids and family what I want for my own. And unless our elected officials, I can tell you that's not true for community board folks on average. I think, and if I felt that, I would tell you differently. I just think there has to be an ability when we hit certain milestones and a threshold of crisis that people can move without seeking counsel. That's all.
Thank you for sharing, Kurt. I mean, that was spot on. The average time it takes to complete a project, coupled with how long it takes to inform a community, it's way too long. I think as a council member, you have but so much time to understand the project that other council members are doing. So you're asking a council member to, through member deference, is understanding someone else's district and putting it within a 3-month concept and seeing if it's good or not. And you have to believe and support that council member and support their decision and negotiation. However, you don't know everything that's gone on beforehand, and you have your own borough, your own district to worry about. So when it comes to all that information, it's just overwhelming for a council member as well. So when we're talking about member deference, it's really taking a step back in the process and understanding how can we best support a decision that is made under normal circumstances that really does involve the right playing actors within the community that really represent the needs of the community, not a small minority that just wants to see things as is.
Both for Kurt and Marjorie, thank you for your statements. My mom was raised in the Fort Greene projects, and then same kind of story, right? That we know just doesn't happen in the same way. What I would say is when you provide further testimony, any ways that you could think about in ULURP that you would want to change, or any ways, particularly as Commissioner Weil was bringing up, in the process of who has the final say, is important for us, because we feel the passion, we feel the sense of urgency, we feel all of those pieces, but we're really looking for tangible examples of where we can do that. So I just want to encourage that. Thanks.
So the only thing I'll say is I've read thoroughly, I'm on the executive committee of Citizens Housing and Planning Council. I've read thoroughly their recommendations that they will be sharing with you on expedited ULURP. I agree with those, suggestions myself. So that's how I feel.
Mr. Bourgeois? I'm sorry, we'll come back around.
Hey, thanks for sharing your story, Marjorie. Kurt, can you talk a little bit about just the decision-making process as you're going out looking for projects? We've heard a lot. We had at the last hearing, we heard someone say ULURP's not the problem. It's only 7 months, sometimes 9 months, and that it itself isn't the problem. There's other problems, and it's not ULURP. So can you talk about, and I think we have a very hard time quantifying the lost opportunity given, what the experience is in our land use process. So can you just talk a little bit about how our land use process actually impacts what even gets off the ground or is conceived of?
That's a great question, Layla. So what I was saying to somebody the other day is the impact of member deference means that there are certain projects we won't even undertake. So my colleagues and I in the development world, we get a steady flow of setups on vacant land and other things, but for this purpose, we'll say vacant land. And then you have a decision to make about whether you're going to try for an entitlement in those locations. And I could just tell you, without mentioning specific neighborhoods, all of which are off the top of my head, that there are many neighborhoods we all know in the city, especially in certain boroughs, where you already know that you're not going to get councilmanic support for an entitlement. And so those situations will never even be brought forward. So there's some number of rezonings that no one ever initiates because we don't believe they'll be successful, or we could get to a point where we spent a year or two or three and it will fail. And so those communities have done an excellent job of getting what they want, meaning they've created such a resistance that we already know we don't want to go there. I think the correct analogy after Brown versus Board of Ed was those communities who were able to make integration of people of color into their schools so unpleasant that folks said, I'm not sending my kids there. And it dragged out the process for integration of public schools. It's exactly the same thing. That there are certain neighborhoods where you know they're not going to allow not only affordable multifamily, any multifamily. And as a developer, you're a business person, so you got a decision to make. Are you going to make a principal stand and lose time and money? Or are you going to go to the path of least resistance in poor neighborhoods where the electeds have been more receptive? And that's what we all do. But that fundamentally doesn't work because it's a fair housing problem, and because we've gotten to a place where those neighborhoods can no longer accommodate the volume of affordable housing we need. So that no longer works. And so from my perspective, we need a dramatic change, and those are some examples.
Commissioner DeBaron?
Good to see both of you and all of you that are here. So it's a lot of things, but keep it simple. The member deference, clearly you're indicating that it is a hindrance to development in certain areas where we would like to have fair share or whatever. And I would assume that it makes it where certain communities are forced, so to speak, to bear the burden of building housing. So specifically, what are your specific suggestions in terms of what we can do with the charter to sort of like change that or amend that?
So first of all, it's good to see you. I would answer it similar to the way I answered Kathy's question, and just generally speaking, there's a platform of things that revisit that CHPC is putting forward that I support. But I think fundamentally having city planning, having a expedited process for affordable housing projects where the focal point is city planning commission approval. And maybe there's a reconstituted city planning where there's more representation, but I see member deference as being something that would be hard to avoid because it's such an informal thing. If city council is the final destination for land use approvals, I just think once that's the case, I just think it's really hard to avoid this. Now, you could have a situation where they could be overridden by City Planning Commission, or where City Planning Commission is the final destination for approval. But I think any of those would work better than what we have now. And honestly, in all the ULURP processes I've been through, and there've been really very many, I've always found my experience at City Planning Commission the most satisfying, because I just feel that it's the hearing I've gotten there on different things through time, whether it's micro units or disposition or a variety of other things, has been fair. I've rarely felt that way about community boards. And certain community boards are worse than others, clearly. and that with council members, it's completely hit or miss. And the truth of the matter is, if you've gone through the years of conversations with a council member and you get their support, by the time you go through this process and get to city council, normally you're in a good enough place. But without exception, I've always had the best experience and experiences before City Planning Commission. And I just feel that should really be the place that's the final arbiter of these sorts of things, in my opinion.
If I could just ask a question to the councilwoman as well. So, we've heard that, I've heard that perhaps there's a thing about how community board members are chosen. And I don't know all the particulars, but is there something to be said about that in terms of what shapes communities? Because we all want to have the voices of the actual community members represented, but I have seen in certain community board situations that they're not reflective of the overall community. So do you have anything to say about that, or suggestions of what we can do to, to look at that?
Sure thing. When I was a council member, oftentimes folks did not even know what a community board were. And so it is, once again, raising awareness and education within the community and saying, hey, you can apply. Even you can have the youth apply, because you can go and be as young as 16. And so it's encouraging awareness and education first within the community. And what is a community board? What can you do with this? And more importantly, how important it is to participate in such a crucial level of government, right? And it is something that beyond awareness, now the council member and certainly the borough president should really emphasize within their communities. And when they're looking to appoint people, it is to look at the local demographics, look at where the voices are needed, and certainly make sure that it is representative of the district itself.
How about term limits?
Term limits, right now, it's 8 years. I'd like to see them shorter.
You said shorter.
Shorter, yes.
Okay. Probably have to be the last question for this panel.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Thank you both for your testimony. Councilmember, I'm sorry to hear your story. I think that's too great of a cost for anyone to bear, and I certainly think it's not acceptable, so I thank you for your courage. Layla pointed out something earlier about opportunity cost, and Kurt, I think it'd be great, maybe in follow-up or something, because you are a developer, to provide some information on, during the time it takes to move something through, how the costs can increase, because certainly in a time where there's a limited amount of money, there's another cost there of crowding out other potential, fundings that could happen and so forth.
Yeah, so your investment of time and money in a private rezoning, for example, means you're not doing something else. And practically, for us, it needs to be a project of scale to justify the investment of time and resources. If you have a piece of property that you've bought and are carrying cost for example, which is really hard to do in this interest rate environment, the private rezoning could be 2 to 4 million, and then whatever the carrying cost on the land is on top of that. And so you could be in a situation, and we were, between 2020 and 2024, which was really the hardest years of my career, because we had multiple entitlements going on and things weren't moving well. And so the combination of the length of time, the expense, just to get to a closing what I always say to folks is, it's really bad for us. It's worse for the people who are waiting for housing. And the last thing I'll say on this, which I think is important, is that people talk about not wanting to embrace entitlements because they're worried about developers making money. But that's like saying, I don't want to get this abscess out of my mouth because the dentist makes too much money, or I would really go for open heart surgery, but do you know how much cardiologists make? And my son really needs help. He has a developmental disability, but do you know how much those people make when they count? It's like I would really want fresh food and fruits and vegetables, but do you know how much the grocer's gonna make? It's not a rational application. And no one thinks that way in any other aspect of their life. The question is, do I need that, and is it fair? And no one really takes, I think, the right approach in thinking about these opportunities as an activist or stakeholder, or many council members not named Marjorie Velasquez. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for this evening. It's great to see you all.
I'm sorry, I have one other question.
I'm sorry.
I apologize. Can you talk about the impact that these rules have on minority and women-owned contractors? With opportunity lost by those who don't have the kind of capital to take on some of the time and opportunity cost burdens you're describing?
So Chair Bury, excellent question. And the reality is that if you, because it costs so much and takes so long, you can't really expect anyone who is a fledgling developer or somebody who's not a generational, multi-generational developer to be involved in this at all. And essentially what you do by having a process like this is that you create a bottleneck and a process where the people who you want most to be involved in development and construction in these communities can't really participate in a meaningful way without a partner. And often if they're a partner, because they can't invest what other people are invest, they don't really have as meaningful a seat at the table. And it's another example of saying we care deeply, but we care not much at all. And I think that's true for my MBE and WBE businesses participating in this process. And it's true for the households waiting for housing at the end, that this process doesn't serve the people stakeholders and community boards say they care most about.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Our next panel includes Eric Lane, the Executive Director of the 1989 Charter Revision Commission, Pascal Leone of the Supportive Housing Network of New York, and Craig Gurian of the Anti-Discrimination Center. Mr. Lane will be appearing via Zoom, and I believe Pascal Leone and Craig Gurian are in person. Of course. Thank you so much. And just so folks are aware while we're doing that, next up will be Professor Moss and Sean Campion of the Citizens Budget Commission after this panel. Yeah, I'm going to ask Eric Lane to go first on Zoom, if you're there.
Okay. So thank you for the opportunity to participate. I've been offered this opportunity by several charter commissions over the last bunch of years, always refusing them because it seemed to me that that to have a real charter revision commission, you needed independent commissioners, independent staff, and issues that would energize the commission. And I see that that's present in this case, so I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I'm grateful that you're willing to undertake this arduous task that you have undertaken. So as the chairman said, I was the counsel and executive director of the 89 Charter Commission. I'm responsible for the deference that you've all heard people speaking about. And yes, I do think there's a way to address it. So let me give you the background of that, why we did it. There's actually a lesson in it for, I think, a commission. And why has, as Commissioner Wild said, it worked for a number of years. I don't know if she was referring to particularly that, so I'm putting this thought in her head, but it did work for a number of years, and I'll tell you why it collapsed. So the original idea was never to have deference among the council members. Although I am a great fan of the legislative process, I worked as the chief counsel of the Senate Democrats in Albany for 6 years. I'm the co-author with the Honorable Abner Mikva of 2 law school texts on the legislative process, and I greatly enjoy participating and observing it. The one thing I never wanted the council to have was the opportunity for this deference. And let me explain to you why. If you give, councils work best when there's a collective sense of policy. There's an issue of policy. Most people have some take on it. The broader it is, the more important it is, the more participation. And that's what councils ought to be doing, like zoning, for example, in the land use case. When it comes to individual projects, the same thing happens every time. They don't care. It's not a policy issue. It's a log rolling issue. It's always about, if you help me, support me in my district, I'll support you when something comes up. Because some of these projects are so small, they're not seen as citywide or even borough-wide, having borough-wide policy impact. So they get less attention from the legislator. There's more value for the legislator to be able to stop the process from going, to stop the project from being built, than there is for him or her to participate. I think Ms. Velasquez, her story was kind of amazing to me. I would never have predicted that kind of anger, but maybe that's the time. But her explanation of what happened is exactly what was intended to happen. And, I think that Fritz Schwartz and I honestly wrote about why we did this in the end. So anyway, we had a plan where originally it was called 3 yeses, where it would never go, there was no automatic call up permissible for the council. So there had to be a combination of the city planning commission supporting a project, the city community board not supporting it, the borough president not supporting it, and then the borough president repeating his not support of it. And if those events occurred, the triple no, then our thought was that this would be a significant enough project to allow council attention. And the hope would be that, this would happen infrequently. One of the lessons that you hopefully will pay attention to that we had was that you have to try, one of your goals is to win. You're not going to spend all this time or letting people testify and then come up with a series of proposals that you think won't win. Would make no sense. Be wasting everybody's time. So politics is part of this business of being on a charter commission. And sort of toward August of '89, a number of our biggest allies, Ruth Messenger, a bunch, NIPERG, a bunch of other groups, started to put a lot of pressure, and they were strong allies of ours from both from a content point of view and from a political perspective. And they began to really put pressure on us with respect to more community, more city council participation on narrower and narrower projects, deference. And, the long and the short of it is that we compromised. We gave in to that pressure politically because they were our strongest allies. And I then had met with Peter Vallone, who was then the speaker, and who was really pushing us a little bit. He wasn't, it's interesting, the leadership of the council was not that overwhelmingly interested in this as an outcome, but he was getting a lot of member pressure. So we met, and he promised me that there would never, deference as you now understand it would never be tolerated in the council, that if the land use committee and the council made a decision, that would be the end of it. And he had Gail Benjamin, who many of you may know. She was the council and executive director, and she was extremely tough on it. And I bet you during the last part of the years after the charter was enacted, under Vallone's leadership, and I don't think there was ever a case of what we're now calling deference. And this was continued for at least the first part of Chris Quinn's speakership. I'm not remembering when Gail Benjamin left, but it doesn't matter. At some point, the pressure from members collapsed the system. And so you get what you're getting now. Seems to me that you could, responding to Commissioner Wild, I think we could just remove the call-up or remove part of that process and end it at the community board, or you could do it, you could go back, you could just remove the automatic call-up, and you could simply go back to the triple no procedure, which allows a debate over whether or not something is so impactful to the community that it ought to get the council process. But I do share the view that you should, figure out something to do about this deference. It's very bad for the council. It's bad, obviously, as I've heard from your witnesses in the last panel, bad for the city, and I think easily remedial. And I don't think that, I don't think it's particularly politically threatening to do that. If you're starting to fool around too much with community boards, I'd pay attention to that from a political perspective, but I don't think this would sink your referendum ship. Anyway, thank you for your time.
Okay, there we go, thanks. Good evening, Chairman Bury and members of the commission. My name is Pascal Leon. I'm the Executive Director of the Supportive Housing Network of New York. We are a membership organization that represents over 200 nonprofits that develop, own, and provide services in supportive housing statewide. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the important opportunities to revise New York City's charter. It's just also a point of privilege just hearing the journeys of your parents as a first-generation Haitian American. It really echoes that of my parents as well. And I want to thank the previous panels for their testimony. I know they left, but for former councilman for her bravery and her courage in trying to develop housing for the last and least among us. So the need for supportive housing, which is permanent affordable housing with on-site services, has never been greater. According to HUD's recent point-in-time count, we've seen the highest number of unhoused individuals in more than a decade, with New York City experiencing an increase, 59% increase in just 1 year. Supportive housing is an evidence-based model that interrupts the cycles of homelessness with individualized case management to address issues like serious mental illness, substance use disorder, chronic health conditions, and other things that serve as barriers to stability. New supportive housing residents are beautiful, state-of-the-art buildings that meet strict environmental and energy efficiency standards. Supportive housing promotes community integration and provides at least 40% of the units in any given residence as affordable housing for low-income members of the community. Oftentimes, it's more than that. For nearly a decade, our community has been working toward the creation of new supportive housing through the city's New York City 1515 and the state's Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative. In 2024 alone, there was over 1,000 supportive housing units opened across New York City in residents containing nearly 1,933 low-income affordable housing units for the community. That brings the total number of supportive housing in New York City to just over 42,000. 25,000 of these units are in purpose-built residence called congregate buildings, and 17,000 are in apartments rented on the private market known as scattered site. As it pertains to land use, the city of Yes streamlined zoning regulations and density bonus for supportive housing, while also opening up more opportunities for affordable and supportive housing development in lower density areas. However, to meet this moment, we need to collectively do more to ensure that we are creating the amount and type of housing that keeps communities stable and healthy and keeps individuals and families out of shelter, off the streets, and out of the subways. Our city's land use policies are focused, unfortunately, on just site-by-site review. This creates a framework where the impact of doing nothing is considered neutral. However, we know that the impact of not developing supportive and affordable housing is dire. Homelessness comes at a great cost to our city or to our communities, from the financial impact of paying for costly shelters to the quality of life, public health, and other safety concerns. A typical supportive housing residence can take 3 to 5 years for development. This is before shovels even touch the ground. ULURP itself takes 1 to 2 years. ULURP pre-certification, which has no time limit, often, has closed door conversations and lengthy review from an understaffed DCP, and it can stretch the process out even further, which, again, has no time limits. As the Charter Revision Commission considers improvements for the city's land use processes, it's important to reach a better balance for citywide and neighborhood priorities. While the current ULURP process is intended to function this way, with consultation for community boards and borough presidents, followed by approval by City Planning Commission, City Council, and the mayor, there are not enough structures and incentives encouraging land use decisions that benefit our city as a whole. One option is to explore fast-tracking development proposals to meet the city-wide objectives, such as 100% affordable housing, deeper affordability, or meeting fair housing goals. We must ensure that the voices of historically marginalized groups, people with disabilities experiencing homelessness, are included. Too often at these community boards or other public meetings, discussions are dominated by a few voices, which may not be representative of the community. Anyone affected by these projects that are absent from these hearings are excluded from consideration, including the people who are homeless, future residents, and even workers among them. Additionally, the development is slowed by a lack of coordination between the city agencies. A revised city charter could update the roles and responsibilities of various agencies, ensuring that HPD and DCP are not duplicating efforts on planning processes. I'm going to jump to the procurement issues. I'm just looking at the time. As it pertains to procurement, many of the network's members operate both supportive and supportive housing and homeless services and make their budgets out of patchwork of state and city government contracts. And these nonprofits are the heart of the response to end and prevent homelessness. And, because, the reliance of city funding, we have serious concerns about the rates of late contract registration and payments. We hear from our nonprofit members that they have millions of dollars of outstanding receivables on their books and fiscally unhealthy reliance on lines of credit due to late contract registration and delayed payments. Outstanding receivables can lead to audit findings. Nonprofit could spend tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars on interest lines of credit, which is not reimbursable. Just to jump to some of the recommendations, our timeline for contract package submitted to the comptroller. The city charter creates a time frame for the comptroller to register 30 days a contract, and we believe that time frame should also be created for city agencies to deliver contract package to the comptroller. Interest on late payments. There must be a mechanism to hold the city to a time frame for registration and payment. We also suggest amending the charter so that nonprofits can actually collect interest when the city pays late. We worked with the network with HSC on a survey that found that 48% of respondents, we surveyed our members, our respective nonprofit members, had to take out loans or lines of credit valued at $87 million and almost $6 million in interest payments. I will stop there and just say that my testimony has more recommendations, but we look forward to creating more transparent and efficient process and contracting, as well as land use, and look forward to working with the commission to that end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Craig Gurian. I've been a civil rights lawyer since 1988 and since 2003, the executive director of the Anti-Discrimination Center. I'm one of the few lawyers in New York City whose consistent focus has been on housing discrimination and housing segregation, and housing segregation is where I'd like to keep the focus. I've been a principal drafter of the structural amendments that make the city human rights law what it is today, starting with the comprehensive 1991 amendments, continuing with the 2005 Local Civil Rights Restoration Act, and including a series of 2016 amendments to broaden the law and protect it from federal rollback. I've taught the history, demographics, law, and remedies of housing discrimination and housing segregation, and invented and brought the landmark federal lawsuit against Westchester County that brought the concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing back from the dead. It pains me to say that while the depth of the pathology is not as deep as it was decades ago, New York City does very much still run on residential segregation. That segregation remains, among other things, the backbone of our politics, our educational system, and our delivery of healthcare. Diverse New York City is 20.2% Black, non-Hispanic overall. It has 59 community districts, but in 18 of those districts, the Black, non-Hispanic population is less than 5%, in 11 of those 18, less than 3%. Where is affordable housing being built? Looking at the 51 city council districts, 14 of those districts had fewer than 50 units built in the period from 22 to 24. By contrast, there were more than 1,000 units in each of 9 council districts. Of those 14 lowest producers, 10 have Black, non-Hispanic populations of less than 5%. How about where public housing is located? 15 council districts have more than 100 NYCHA locations, but in the 14 lowest producing districts for affordable housing, 7 apparently have 0 NYCHA residential addresses, another has but 1, and 2 have only 10. So the pattern is really unmistakable. Any serious effort in the direction of fair housing must tackle those disparities head on. And one last preliminary point. There are unique and critically important data that were obtained in the happily now resolved lawsuit brought against the city for its outsider restriction policy in affordable housing lotteries, where community district incumbents had preference for 50% of the units. We gathered data on millions of lottery applications made by several 100,000 unique households. And it turned out that whether the household was Asian, Hispanic, Black, or white, approximately 85% of the unique applicants, about 85%, applied for housing outside of their community district at least 75% of the time. Thus, there's a huge gap between what you hear from hyper-local advocates who proclaim the importance of maintaining the status quo and the choices actual New York families are seeking to make. So in 2 minutes, what's to be done? I've sketched a wide-ranging variety of proposals in the document that I've circulated to you, going far beyond what I have an opportunity to talk about right now. I'm happy to take questions about that. As others have told you, member deference has been a fair housing disaster here and everywhere else it has existed. The question isn't whether to get rid of it, but how. City of Yes took some important steps, but faltered, especially when it comes to the most exclusionary neighborhoods that have built least. The fair housing framework is also important, but lacks any mechanism for enforcement of targets. The most concrete solution means tangibly reducing the council's ability to block affordable housing construction. So one specific thing that would apply from a fair housing lens would be expanding beyond City of Yes the scope of affordable housing permitted as of right in districts that remain highly segregated on at least one dimension, especially given our history, districts with a disproportionately low percentage of Black, non-Hispanic residents. 2, lag significantly in affordable housing units built, and 3, have disproportionately few housing units. It could also mean applying a multiplier to the housing production targets in the fair housing plan to those districts that are most segregated and least contributing. It may be that the commission would prefer an alternative or supplemental solution that is more case by case, with city planning approval required, and where the giving of that approval is dispositive, absent an override by a 2/3 supermajority of the council within 30 days. One final thought very quickly. You can't solve the city's affordable housing and fair housing crises without recognizing the regional element. Suburban exclusionary zoning and segregation has been intense and unrelenting for decades. Look at the percentage of households in the 5 surrounding suburban counties with household income below $35,000 a year, 13% of households. New York City, 25.7%, essentially double. Yet no one is currently tasked with trying to vindicate the city's fair housing interest in suburbs taking on their fair share of affordable housing production, an interest which conveniently is remediable not only under federal law, but under state law as well. So I'd be happy to take any questions you have now or later on the broader document.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up to questions from the commissioners for our 3 panelists.
Hi, good evening, panelists. Thank you for your testimony. Good to see you, Pascal. Glad you can come. I had a question, or it's a little bit more of a comment, but want to hear your perspective as it relates to nonprofits who are developers that have carrying costs that come along with developing property because of the length of time, and then you layer on top of that, right, the payment system, the procurement that you mentioned. We do know in New York, a lot of, the chair asked a question to Kurt about MWBE carrying courses, and that is something that is, detrimental to their balance sheet. But we are seeing also nonprofit developers in general starting to, not be able to potentially be in existence if we can eliminate that. So I'm glad that there are very specific recommendations that you have in the written testimony for that. But can you give a little feel as to how many of your members are in such a dire state that they may be in a position of having to merge or not being available to provide these services?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And we actually looked at data for the last 20 years. Because of such low rates we've had for one particular project called NYSHIP, the New York State Supportive Housing Program, we had 1/3 of the providers who are NYSHIP providers either had to close their doors, had to merge with other organizations, or even worse, had to convert, supportive housing to market rate housing as a result. And we're seeing more of this. And compounding, you named it, right? The issues of the late contract payments, the compounding issue of, the federal, what we're seeing at the federal level, right? With COC contracts not being renewed. This will take providers under, for sure. Not having the rental assistance is the developers and owners who will go, projects will go under. And again, we could take a page from the 1980s in the Reagan era when we saw 3/4 of HUD's budget cut in 8 years. And what did that do? That led to the widespread homelessness that we see now. This was not always the case, right? And we could really tie that back. We're at this moment again, where the, not being paid on time, the high cost to just construct, the lengthy process. Again, I know members who've spent 8 to 10 years to develop and open projects. And then now we have this potential, not even a potential, just the looming cuts that we're waiting for HUD. Thank you, Valerie.
Hi, thank you so much, both of you, for your testimony. I have a question for each one of you. First, for Ms. Leon, you spoke a bit about, and thanks for your testimony, housing with on-site services. You're probably the only testimony we've heard to date that specifically requested on-site services. Could you talk a little bit more about that, a model that you would love to expand, and why we should be thinking about this?
Yeah, no, and supportive housing, again, came from the movement in response to, widespread homelessness that was made due to failures in policy. And so, the model is actually a case management model. So it's not providing clinical services, and it's evidence-based. It works, right? We have folks who maintain housing for the long term, 90 to 95% in 24 months or 12 months retention, right? And so it provides a case manager who connects folks to resources in the community, whether it be mental health services, substance abuse counseling, vocational services, helping with, finding a job, just really the glue and being that person. We all need help in some capacity, right? But for folks who really struggle with underlying conditions like significant mental health disorders, having a case manager, having supportive housing has really been that lifeline. I could bring hundreds of tenants here that will tell you just how supportive housing has saved their lives.
Yeah, and we know that one time we had quite a few models and they were scaled back because the state pulled back on funding for that. So I would just like to make sure in the testimony you speak to some of the evidence of those models so that they could also be seen as an incentive for others.
Will do. Thank you.
My question for you is you began your conversation particularly talking about Black non-Hispanic, right? And looking at racial segregation, particularly through that lens. But you talked about double the rate of those at $35,000 living in this city at 25.7%. Could you give me the demographic breakdown of that number?
I don't have that at hand. I'm happy to provide that to
Yeah.
you, but I mean, it's just very compelling evidence of something that we all know, which is that the suburbs have not done anything like their fair share in taking on the need for regional housing. They have existing obligations in a variety of statutes to
No,
do that.
I totally get that, but when I'm looking at that number too, I know most likely has a disproportionate Latino impact in that number. And so it'd just be really good to have the demographic breakdown of that number as well.
That we'll be able to easily pull that.
It doesn't take away from the
no,
argument. What
I
it does
think-
is it talks about it in a multiple, both racial and ethnic way around the impact of who is
Well,
needing the
and
housing.
there's also a very concrete and practical impact on that, impact of that, because in terms of the legal remedies that are available, in terms of the exclusion that so many of the suburban towns and villages practice, the fact that it has a disparate impact on prospective Black and Hispanic residents is a critical legal issue.
Yeah, there's no question that both the race and class piece play on this, and I just want to make sure that we have the representative information of that.
We'll make sure to
Thanks.
get that to
Thank
you.
Thank you both, but thank you all. This is a request really, I think, for Eric and Craig to think about if you can, one of the things that you have both mentioned, both in your written testimony and Eric in your verbal testimony, was the unintended consequences of changes or provisions that get put forward that create accountability issues or create a lack of collaboration that would be helpful in terms of meeting some of our overall goals. I would ask each of you to consider, as you think about, you had said something here about the composition of the city council, and Eric, I think you talked about ways that we can look at member difference differently. If you can be more specific with with at least an understanding of unintended consequences that could come from whatever suggestions you put forward or whatever suggestions you've also heard here, I think would be very helpful to us.
Be delighted to do that, but I have one just very quick piece of unsolicited advice, which is a group which is serious like this, which is quite a refresher from what one sees on television and Twitter.
We're real.
There's one of the problems that comes with that is like this idea that you're gonna nail it and you're gonna get it perfect. And the reality, and I think Eric would probably acknowledge this, is, the pendulum always swings. And in that last major effort, now more than
Some decades.
30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, the pendulum swung away from executive control and to a much more robust, what was hoped to be a much more robust council. So, absolutely true. It's important to think about unintended consequences. I will take my homework seriously. But it's also the case that there will be council charter revision commissions in the future who say, well, now we have a circumstance where the council's feeling frisky, this new council is feeling frisky about development, and we have a mayor who doesn't want to do anything about, and you're going to have to revise it again. It's not like the platonic ideal of things. You sort of have to respond to political developments as they
No
occur.
doubt, we're just trying to do our best to anticipate what some of those swings could be and what some of the ultimate goals that we're trying to achieve are and how to balance those trade-offs.
The emergency thing that Kirk
Yeah.
was, I thought, interesting.
Yeah.
Or the other three negative votes Moss
Because
raised.
you could respond to the emergency situation.
If you put in certain
Yeah.
guidelines. Thank you.
Layla and Carl?
First, Pascal, thanks for all your work and Shinny's work and all your members' work and advocacy. It's really impactful. Craig, good to see you. Last time we met, you were deposing me.
It's amazing. There are
glad I get
so
to
so many people
ask
on
you
the
questions this
commission
time.
who I have not deposed.
That's right. I was wondering, Craig, if you could share a little bit, I know it's in your written testimony, and looking forward to reading it, your thoughts on the Speaker's Fair Housing Framework, and how that helps us move the needle, and what more we can do to ensure it has teeth. And as a second question, if you could tell us a little bit of what you know about HUD's complaints around Chicago's aldermanic privileges practices and what similarities you see to practices in New York or differences.
To take the second one first, I'm really not versed on the complaint itself, but I've followed quite a bit of the sort of informal complaints about that system, and that exists in Boston as well, and it's pretty simple. It's a very localized lens that lends itself to louder voices. Sometimes it lends itself to pernicious influences, and it's just not designed to be asking the question, what do all of us need? Nor contemplating the idea that neighborhoods can be dynamic. It's much more someone with a constituency who is happy with that constituency, has issues of choice, as HPD is putting it, or mobility, the furthest thing from his or her mind, and I think it works very similarly. So I don't know the answer to that. What was the for? Oh, yeah. I mean, as an analytical tool, I think it's helpful. I think it's fantastic to have citywide targets that are identified. I think that it will be very helpful for residents generally, and perhaps advocates even more, to understand that the deeply affordable housing doesn't all have to be in one place, that if the city is handling it and not reducing the amount of that housing, that's something to keep your eye on. It's excellent that there are the community board targets, but there are really these two issues: that there's no enforcement mechanism whatsoever, and that the issues that have to do with historic segregation are not taken into account, and they're not really highlighted if you look through the law, which is why one of the things that I do think would be useful, and I think it does need for legal protection for there to be a combination provision where the city acknowledges its own historic role. The preamble to the charter as it exists now talks very nicely about national issues, but doesn't say anything about what New York has done in the past. So that gives you the opportunity to do things that are race-based, ethnicity-based, and really responding very specifically and saying, you do not make up for this disparity by saying, well, we're going to leave it, or we're not going to make it worse. But like 10 years on, you still have the disparity. You have to do more if you're going to be remedying. And so that's why identifying, it doesn't have to be 10, it could be 8, it could be 12. You want to have a mechanism so that the worst performers on the scale that I've talked about, most segregated, least public housing, least production, have the target that would otherwise be established, but have a multiplier that, and I mean, I'd be happy to talk about it more if this is something that moves forward at all, a multiplier so that there really can be progress towards remedy, not just a keeping things the way they are.
Thank you. Commissioner Westbrook, you the last question for this panel?
Yes, this is a question for Mr. Lane. He's still there? I know that a number of suggestions have been made to make the City Planning Commission the final arbiter if, as a means of avoiding or dealing with member deference. And I know the '89 Charter Commission had some concerns about guardrails to make sure that the City Planning Commission itself did not become a legislative body or be seen as a legislative body, and thus potentially violating principle of one person, one vote. Do you think that there are guardrails in this area that would limit the City Planning Commission to become the final arbiter of land use actions?
What guardrails that would stop them from becoming it, such as administrative body becoming a legislative body?
The answer is yes, that was my question.
I mean, there is a problem with with an administrative body becoming a legislative body, but I don't see the issue of deference has nothing to do with the interest of being a legislative body, because that's why I think we gave them the power, and that's why I think you could take it away from them if you wanted to with no trouble. I don't think the question's a legal question about whether the City Planning Commission or some administrative agency could be the final voice on, whether a particular small project, housing project, whatever it might be, is placed in a particular district. That's an administrative decision that we tried to keep from the council until we decided not to. So I don't think there's a legal problem with, if you're just limiting it to that. If you're starting to talk about zoning issues, then I think you have to have the council's involvement, because I think that's been it's been decided in the past that zoning's a legislative matter. But in terms of everything else, as it goes through the ULURP process, is not a problem of legality. It's a problem, it's a political issue, it's how you incorporate the community voices in the process, but it's not a question of removing a guardrail that would make something go from legal to illegal. I don't believe that would be true in anything other than the zoning or types of issues like that where it really is a legislative voice. I might not agree with you doing it, but I don't think it's a legal issue.
And I don't want to take time here, but so many of the issues that go to the council do in fact involve zoning changes. And so I just ask you, if there have to be guardrails, if the city planning.
The zoning, if you're talking about a variance or something, that's not a legislative act.
I'm not talking about a variance, I'm talking about a zoning change. But I just asked,
Okay, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, may I just speak to that for 15 seconds, if I may?
Thank
Very.
you so much.
Your question is precisely why I do think that there is utility to having the availability of the final council step, although one that is more difficult than simply getting a council majority. Having a 2/3 council veto keeps the council in the process, and well, I mean, you could make the judgment on the politics of it, but it is certainly the case that 34 council members on multiple occasions have been able to agree to a whole variety of things. And I think if you're looking at something to try to make sure that there's a backup, a stop guard, that would be a way to do it.
So I would just ask you, and I want to keep longer, but just on this question, I think part of the question that I have is that I'm not sure I understand what the difference would be between a majority vote versus a supermajority vote. If the problem is not, in fact, the problem is deference to an individual, which does not change if you have a 50% vote, a 60% vote, or an 80% vote. So I know, if you could think about that.
I have a sort of a quick answer to it, because there, at least in terms of the council as it is constituted and as it has been constituted for a while, there is we like our deference the way we have it caucus. So it's not simply that the one person, I mean, right now, the one person's able to stop something. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that if something's being stopped, it isn't just the individual member, and it's not the members who say, we live in the suburbs, even though it's called New York City, so like we need 18 parking spots, and it's like we don't want the kind of slum that a townhouse represents. You want to be able to do that and make sure that it has to be a very significant percentage of members who vote that way.
Thank all three of you so much. I'd like to call up the next panel. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Next panel is Mitchell Moss, professor at NYU, and Sean Campion, the Citizen Budget Commission. And just so that folks are prepared, the final expert panel before we go to public testimony will be Shaniqua Charles from Miss Abby's Kids and Brandon Chang from the New York Housing Conference. Mr. Campion, if you could begin and just make sure the red light is on, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Sean Campion. I'm Director of Housing and Economic Development Studies at the Citizens Budget Commission. Thank you, Chair Bury and the other commissioners, for the opportunity to testify today. I've submitted our full testimony, so I just wanted to give some highlights. CBC's 2022 report on New York City's land use review process found that it's too long, it's too expensive, and it's too uncertain. The median private application takes 2 to 3 years to make it through the process, which adds as much as $82,000 to the cost of developing each new housing unit, putting numbers to some of the issues that Kurt was talking about before. And those are just the projects that actually get through the process and get approved. Unfortunately, the process itself discourages projects from getting proposed at all. And too often, local concerns and member deference override the citywide need to build more housing everywhere in all neighborhoods. Some of that cost uncertainty results from environmental review, which is a matter of state law and not the charter, but the review process, known as ULURP, is entirely within the city's control. So accordingly, CBC is making 3 recommendations for revisions to ULURP to make the land use process simpler and faster while maintaining the intent of ULURP as a time-limited review that incorporates both local and citywide perspectives. So the first recommendation is to merge the community board and the borough president advisory reviews into a single review under the BPs. So consolidating those 2 reviews, which now take 90 days, would make the advisory review process shorter and more productive. BPs have a larger constituency, which allows them to balance neighborhood concerns with borough-wide and citywide needs, including the residents who may actually live in housing that gets built. And they also have professional land use staff that can support reviews. They also still appoint community board members, so they can still incorporate community board opinions into their own decision-making as well. The second is to allow applicants to appeal actions rejected by the city council to a ULURP appeals board consisting of the city planning commission and the council speaker. The council has an important role in the ULURP process, but a well-designed appeals process could maintain that role while better balancing citywide and neighborhood concerns. So that's why we're recommending the creation of an appeals board with a temporary addition of the city council speaker as a 14th member, just for the appeal to ensure the representation of the council's perspective as well in that process. And to override, the appeals board would need to approve an application by a supermajority of 10 of 14 votes. And our hope is that that would encourage the speaker to bring more projects to a vote and potentially more applications to come forward, particularly for well-considered projects that are never getting proposed in the first place due to member deference. And our third is to focus ULURP on zoning and shift review of both non-zoning actions currently subject to ULURP and modest rezoning applications with no adverse impacts to city agencies or commissions for advisory reviews. So first on the non-zoning actions, as Eric was discussing too, ULURP makes a whole host of non-zoning actions subject to public review as well, along with legislative zoning changes. We think that full ULURP should be reserved for those zoning map amendments that are legislative in nature, and that other actions currently subject to ULURP be shifted to those city agencies for administrative reviews, with those agencies given the discretion to approve or deny based on specific findings and in accordance with city and state laws. Our full testimony outlines all of where we think all those actions should go, which we'll need to get into right now. For the modestly resized zoning applications, CBC recommends that review and approval of smaller projects shift to a review that ends at the City Planning Commission. This shorter review could apply to projects that, based on their size and their location, wouldn't have an adverse impact on communities. For example, projects designated as type 2 in the city's environmental review process, a standard that would pick up projects that now qualify for the Green Fast Track environmental review streamlining. That matters because the review process increases the cost of small residential projects, the most of any, by 15% at least, not including financing. Those are the small projects that Kurt mentioned aren't worth going through ULURP and that Vishan presented at a previous hearing as well. And that's even before considering member deference, which may lead to concessions or exactions, which might make projects infeasible. Still, both those pathways shouldn't replace New York City's as-of-right development system, nor should it be an alternative to neighborhood rezonings and citywide rezonings, which are needed to increase and provide additional residential as-of-right capacity that we need to boost housing production everywhere. Ultimately, any changes to the charter, as we mentioned, need to be crafted with care, unless they make the process more complicated or introduce unintended consequences. So we welcome your input and feedback, and we'll continue to evaluate other revisions that come forward as well, and may comment on them or endorse them in the future as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moss.
Thank you, Chairman Bury, and thank you, Vice Chairman Greenberger. And I want to thank members of the commission for inviting me in. I also want to thank the executive director and the staff of the commission, because by inviting me, I got an hour and a half lesson in some of the challenges about housing, and I cannot resist the opportunity to correct some of the statements that have preceded. First, let me just say this. ULURP isn't the only thing that has stalled housing. We have aggressively landmarked areas that are undeserving. Just because something old doesn't mean it's important. In fact, just the opposite is the case. We also are too inflexible. We should undo landmarks like the south side of 8th Street in Greenwich Village, where we have preserved Dunkin' Donuts and other locations. The corridor on Lafayette Street, which is in NoHo, has parking lots, industrial structures filled with mass transit access that is a combination of historic preservation and manufacturing, limiting housing. So it isn't ULURP which is the sole cause of our problem. One. Two, I want to say that I'm very concerned. There's such a tendency here to think that we should replace elected members of the council with power given to appointed officials. I want to say just the opposite. I'm a fan of what Fritz Schwartz and Eric Lane did, but they did it 35 years ago. It's not that it needs updating. This was before the iPhone, before social media, before robotics, before AI. And I just want to say, it's time to recognize that nothing lasts 35 years. Even, in modern physical, everybody gets facelifts, everybody gets eye lifts. We should think the charter deserves even more. And the point here I want to say is that they diminished the borough president correctly because that was the source of the Supreme Court decision to make it unconstitutional. But they diminished it so it's really a junior varsity. I mean, it's a cheerleader role. We should think about reinserting the borough presidents and diminishing the council members. And I'm going to get my testimony will reveal that. So we should give them a job. We're paying them. They have a staff. There's no reason they should get up in the morning and wonder what they do. And they have lost their administrative responsibility, which they once had. They once controlled streets and highways. They once controlled parks. We should put them back to work. So let me just say a few words, and I want to live within the time limit. And so this is what I want to say. I have a few different ideas, and I'm sure that they're not going to be at the macro level you've heard. But first, I want to say that when we're dealing with lots zoned for residential purposes across the city, we should allow owners of those properties to build housing with 8 units or less that's in a residential zone already, so we're not rezoning it. We may have to deal with the higher densities. And we should do this in a way that allows small-scale development to completely bypass ULURP. Let it be saved for units of 8 or 10 or higher. And the way we should do this is with a one-stop expedited review process, landing in the office of the borough president, who then has 60 days to make a decision. Many of them don't know how to make a decision. They'll learn. And I think this is not trivial. We should treat the borough president seriously. And then that decision-making should then go to the council, and the council as a whole, not to the committees, which we've heard about, and not the members, but they have to review this. And I know it's bypassing the City Planning Commission. Let them focus on the larger scale challenges. City Planning Commission has enough to do. And if you go to Greenpoint, you see an average home which had 1 or 2 units, and now they have 8. This is something which is done across the city. We should not trivialize it, but we should encourage it. The second part I want to say, and I think this, this builds on Eric Kober's testimony, I think at an earlier hearing. He suggested this for units of 6 or more with a 35-foot height limit. I would raise it to 8 and 40 feet. In other words, I think we could go further and let the owners determine what the size of the units are. The second point I want to make is a simple one, which is we have neighborhood plans for housing that now comply with city planning and building regulations. With climate change becoming a pervasive part of everyone's life, we should recognize that housing has an impact on the water supply, on the wastewater treatment and solid waste, and on mass transit and surface transportation. And that rather than have assessments over the course of 30 to 50 years, we should simply require that all proposed housing developments that have to meet city requirements should include those basic environmental assessments, but for a 10-year period, recognizing that we're not going to ask them to plan forever. The third idea, and I want to say it builds on the report by the Robin Hood Foundation, but it takes a little bit further than you guys did, which is to suggest that we think about the rules we have for what is a housing unit. Now, 100 years ago, I don't think no one was here, we required windows to be put into bedrooms because they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have ventilation systems, and it was a very intelligent part of improving public health. The Pew Foundation for Research just came out with a report that points out that you have new technologies, including advanced ventilation systems, that eliminate the need for windows in open residential buildings. There are a vast amount of underused, almost obsolete industrial and office buildings, which could be easily modernized if we got rid of the window requirement for bedrooms. And I mean, we would have triple or quadruple the amount of buildings, and if you notice, you read carefully, some of them are going at less than half their price of 5 years ago. So I want to propose that the window in every bedroom is an impediment to housing construction and is obsolete. And New York City should allow windowless bedrooms in structures, certainly for any structure within 2,000 feet of a warehouse, a vehicular-based truck terminal, and certainly of any publicly owned bridge or tunnel, which are truly sources of hazardous chemicals. And finally, I want to make one modest suggestion, which I'm sure will upset many, but we're going to take a risk. Why not? That's why you be a professor, So we have in our buildings all kinds of features which add costs. And I want to propose that New York City eliminate any requirements for home baking ovens in the kitchen. The modern kitchen should have internet access, plumbing for kitchen sink, running water, and electrical systems to accommodate whatever people cook with, microwave, surface cooking, and the air fryer, etc. In Japan, housing doesn't even have baking ovens. They use steaming and boiling. I'm not recommending this as a technique, but I want to make a point. The size of households varies in this city enormously, from 2 or less, some to 3 or more, but we should not impose a baking oven and all the infrastructure required to support this, as well as the size. And if you go, I asked my college students about this today. I have 54 students. They don't even know what an oven is. They don't know how to make coffee. They put sweaters in their ovens. Now, this is an important point. We should think about reducing the actual cost of a housing unit. And rather than try to beat up on the unions, you're not going to win that battle. Let us try to figure out to lower the actual fixed costs of building residential units. So I would suggest that we allow buildings to have shared kitchens. So once a month or once every year, you have your family over, you can figure out a way to entertain them. But overwhelmingly, we should reduce the size, scale, and investment in kitchens to reflect the modern habits of ordering in, taking out, not eating at all as a family, and to reduce the cost of the housing unit will be a way to add to the number of units you can build. So let me thank you for my opportunity to talk to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you both so much. Any questions for the panel? I can't believe there are no questions for that.
I'm assuming both of you have submitted basically your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have one question. I just want to make sure I heard Professor Moss. You were suggesting, if I understood correctly, that for units that let's say have 8 or less, but you can tell them a number, that you would not have a ULURP process for already residential units, and you would go to a professional, some professional staff person who would make the decision. And then were you saying that that decision would go to the borough president for the final
Well, and I
stop?
was really saying the borough president they have planning professionals working for them, but let the borough president be responsible. I think it's great to give elected officials direct responsibility. And they would do this. And by the way, it frees up the council member from any burden. And it also changes the character of who's feeling the pain, because they're going to have to weigh all the different inputs and let them have to do it. It also shortens the entire planning and regulatory system.
All right, so that's within the borough president's office.
Yes.
Thank you. And were you suggesting that that would be appealable to the council?
I think I'm going to take a chance to say this. I think the council, we should honor their role. Look, the charter actually was great about giving the council representative functions. I mean, they knew what they were doing. The mayor had a management authority, the council representative. I would trust the council. If the borough president had that decision, that's a lot different than having 51 members, each of whom represent districts of 152,000, which may be elected with 3,000 people or less. I would rather bypass them. You have to remember, there are councilmanic primaries which you can win with 1,800 votes.
Mitchell, is what your proposals, though, weren't they already allowed in City of Yes?
I'm going to defer to the Crackerjack staff.
I don't know. What? No, the
6 units or less, 35 would be in.
the development of the low rise, the small unit development, because they eliminated, they made the zoning as of right.
Right, I made it, I think I went higher than that.
What?
No, I don't think they went as high as what we would.
Well, at 4 stories. Okay, I was confused as to whether.
We'll clarify what the rules are. Any other questions for this panel? Thank you so much. I got it. The final expert panel is Shaniqua Charles and Brandon Chang. Please forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Great. Okay, thank you so much.
You have a PowerPoint.
I'm sorry? Oh, you do? Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good evening. My name is Brendan Cheney. I'm the Director of Policy and Operations at the New York Housing Conference. I want to thank the Commission for the opportunity to testify tonight. New York Housing Conference is a nonprofit affordable housing policy and advocacy organization. As a broad-based coalition, our mission is to, next slide. Our mission is to advance city, state, and federal policies and funding to support the development and preservation of decent and affordable housing for all New Yorkers. My testimony today will show the extent of the housing crisis and how unequal our housing supply is distributed, highlighting the need for change. We are currently working with our partners to come back with recommendations, more specific recommendations for change at the Charter Commission hearing in Manhattan next month. Okay, so we are very clearly in a housing crisis. Rents and homelessness are at record highs and keep growing. And in 2023, we had the lowest rental vacancy rate in more than 50 years at just 1.3%. We clearly do not have enough housing to meet demand. Great, and as rents are rising, incomes are not keeping up. As this chart shows, rents are rising much faster than income and wages since 2007, which means New Yorkers are paying a greater share of their income in rent. Next slide, thank you. In fact, more than 850,000 households in New York City are paying more than 30% of their income in rent, a common measure of rent burden, and nearly 500,000 are paying more than half of their income in rent. The main causes of the crisis are a lack of housing supply and the lack of affordable housing. New York is not building enough housing to keep up with demand. In fact, we're building less new housing than many comparable metro areas. So the way to address the housing crisis is to increase overall housing supply and increase affordable housing specifically. But we also want to make sure that we add housing more equitably across the city than we have been. As you can see in this map, most of our affordable housing is being built in a small number of council districts. Over the past 10 years, 10 city council districts financed more than 3,500 units of affordable housing each. The bottom 10 districts finance just 200 units or less. We can see the districts that are building more housing have certain things in common. They're more likely to be communities of color and more likely to have lower average incomes. Next slide. So just to give a quick sense of which districts are building the most housing and how much, you can see that Councilmember Salamanca's district, 17 in the Bronx, built 7,100 units of affordable housing over the past 10 years. And you can see going down the list, these are the 10 districts, all of them have built more than 3,500 units. But again, some at 7,000, 6,000, 6,000. So these are the districts that are building the most. Next slide. And these are the districts that are building the least. They're building less than 30 units of affordable housing over 10 years, less than 50 units of affordable housing over 10 years. All of them building less than 200 units of affordable housing over that time period. All right, next slide. So in the neighborhoods building the most affordable housing, 70% of the residents are Black or Latinx on average, while in the neighborhoods building the least affordable housing, only 30% of residents are Black or Latinx. And in the top building neighborhoods, the average income is $67,000 per year compared to $87,000 in the neighborhoods with the least new affordable housing. Housing and affordable housing are assets to all communities. Every neighborhood can and should add more housing, but neighborhoods that are whiter and higher income are opting out, choosing not to allow new housing and new affordable housing. This needs to change, especially in a housing crisis. Neighborhoods cannot opt out. So when we come back with recommendations for the commission, it will be to make changes to make it easier to build housing in every neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Charles.
Testing. There it is. Hey, y'all. Good evening, peace and blessings, peace and many blessings, member of the Charter Revision Committee. My name is Shaniqua Charles. I'm the Executive Director of Miss Abby's Kids, a community and legislative organizer, have served on Community Board 7 on 5 or more committees, including land use and have worked on city, state, and federal legislation, amongst various other roles from the Fordham section of the Bronx. I'm here today because specific sections of the New York City Charter are directly contributing to what I believe is a housing crisis that our communities are facing. The Charter, as it stands, is failing people of the Bronx. Deepest gratitude to Shams, the housing hero, for curating spaces that include all community stakeholders and the entire commission for holding these very necessary hearings. Part of the problem connecting the charter to lived experience, if I may, while the food desert, economic stability, local hiring, community benefits agreements continue to be problematic, this evening's 5-minute focus is going to be dedicated towards the housing issues that are plaguing us all. The Bronx faces the highest rates of eviction, severe overcrowding, substandard housing conditions in New York City. Families are forced to choose between rent and food. Let me repeat that. Families are forced to choose between rent and food, live with dangerous mold and lead, and are constantly under the threat of displacement. This isn't about statistics. It's about the families that Miss Abby's Kids has continued to serve over the last 13 years. The current charter, specifically chapters 8 and 9, ULURP subsection 197C and 197D, and subsection 200 to 204, create land use review processes that are slow, complex, and give advisory power to community boards, the borough president, while city planning and city council hold a real decision-making power. Chapter 70, subsection 813 and 814, outlining the borough president's powers, provide no meaningful authority to proactively address the housing crisis or oversee proper land use rights. And this is very clear from all of my time spent on land use committees of Community Board 7 for many years. We see consequences of this in projects like the stalled redevelopment of the Kingsbridge Armory, where decades of planning have yielded little to no affordable housing due to these systemic hurdles. The Sherman Plaza development, facing much community discourse, is another example of how lengthy and complicated the ULURP process is. And again, having served on Community Board 7 for a number of years, the power of community members to be involved in the decision-making process of potential housing development needs to absolutely be increased, particularly when we're talking about people who have been in a community, have lived in a community, raised their families in a community for decades and decades and decades. Health is also impacted by these decisions that are harmful to our communities. This housing crisis is a public health crisis. Substandard housing directly contributes to asthma, lead poisoning, and other chronic illnesses. Overcrowding increases the spread of the infectious diseases. The stress of housing insecurity devastates the mental health. I want to rewind on that just for a second. The stress of housing insecurity devastates mental health. These health disparities concentrated in the Bronx are unacceptable, and I'm hoping that the charter chooses to address these root causes that primarily start with the housing issues. Some of the proposed solutions is if we need concrete revisions. And I'm urging the committee to consider the following, because I don't come with just the problem, y'all. Mama also come with a few solutions. Y'all ready for that? Say yes, yes. I didn't hear y'all. Can I get a yes, yes? Okay. So some of the reforms. Let's try to reform the ULURP process, which earlier stated was in chapters 8 and 9, and create an expedited ULURP process for projects meeting specific deep affordability criteria, such as significant percentage of units below 40% of AMI. And just to interject right there momentarily, I just became aware of a bill that our sitting assembly member has passed in the last session that addresses the AMI issue. And for those maybe in the audience who are not familiar with the AMI, including the richest and most developed counties alongside Bronxites who are making $17,000 to $21,000 a year. To my knowledge, that has been amended. So kudos to our Assembly Member George Alvarez for that. Amend subsection 197C and 197D and give binding weight to community board and borough president recommendations on projects meeting these affordability thresholds. Now, again, of course, we don't want all power being in any one particular hand, but to my knowledge and being involved in different meetings and situations like this where community voices are heard, at least our voices will be heard in those atmospheres, and they should also hold weight. Eliminate member deference, which we mentioned earlier, and I heard a couple of people saying a few different things about that, but eliminate member deference to amend the charter to ensure that land use decisions are made based on the need rather than the preferences of the individual council members. And this change would, of course, promote equitable development, prevent localized opposition from hindering essential projects, and perhaps we should look into what could be an oversight committee for those who believe that there might not be an answer to council member deference. Okay, empower the borough president in chapter 70 and subsection 813 and 814 so that there's some explicit authority and dedicated funding to 1, create a housing stability task force, 2, establish a borough-wide right to counsel program. I spent many years working on the right to counsel legislation some years ago. It did not cover all Bronx sites. It only covered particular zip codes. I see some people shaking their heads, so I know you know what I'm talking about. And 3, initiate zoning changes to promote affordable housing, which we're saying that affordable housing should include multifaceted assets so that not only are people getting affordable housing, but we're also curating projects that can be sustainable to builders and such, okay? Prioritize deep affordability, add a new section to the charter that requires a specific percentage of deeply affordable housing, targeting the lowest income levels, and in all new developments receiving city subsidies and zoning changes. This goes beyond the current mandatory inclusionary housing provisions. Data transparency and accountability, which would amend Chapter 1, subsection 14F, which deals with agency reporting to require the collection and public reporting of detailed data on housing conditions, evictions, health outcomes related to housing, and disaggregated by neighborhood and demographic groups. So housing is not enough to just curate the housing. We need to also be mindful that the housing needs to be safe and that it needs to be fruitful to the families that will be there. And dedicated funding to housing initiatives, which is addressed in Chapter 70 and amend subsection 813 and 814 to grant some explicit authority and dedicated funding again via the borough president as an avenue for housing initiatives for legal representation and education around tenants' rights. In conclusion, the Bronx absolutely deserves a charter that prioritizes basic human right to safety, healthy, and affordable housing. And I believe that these revisions targeted specific to these sections of the New York City Charter are essential to creating a more just and equitable future for our borough. And I look forward to the bold and audacious changes that you all look like you are willing to make. Yes, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions for the panel?
Hi, I just wanted to say first, thank you for the discussion and inclusion, particularly the focus on expanding the housing supply doesn't deal as much with the existing and the risk, particularly of those that are being kicked out or living in inadequate housing. So I just appreciate that. And so I know in your testimony, any data that you can provide on that, I know we'd love to see as well too. So
Yeah, absolutely. So what are we in, 2025 now? Did we switch the year? Okay. So if we want to go back about a decade, when we studied what Bronx evictions looked like, when we were reworking Bronx Housing Court and how non-tenant centered Bronx Housing Court actually was, although the original purpose was to be protecting tenants, we saw 33,000 Bronx sites evicted annually.
And I should let you know too, that one of the programs at the Fund for the City of New York is actually Right to Counsel. So I am familiar, I just want to make sure that that data is included
Absolutely.
in the testimony, because I think that's important too. It's not just about, I just appreciate the depth of where you went. I just really want to recognize that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Present day, through a lot of the work that we did through Right to Counsel, so shout out to you for that, and making sure that Bronxites had legal representation as exists in criminal court as of right. We were able to reduce the number from 33,000 to 4,000 currently. And that is a tremendous drop over the last decade, and I'm really, really proud of that work that has transpired. Present day, so 4,000 was the 2023 numbers. We're hanging around 3,500 at this point, which that's 3,500 out of about 11,000 of all 5 boroughs that were actively evicted. That's not including the number that was taken to court, which if we dive deeper into that study, we'll find some more really resounding factuals there. But the fact that people had access to lawyers as of right absolutely decreased that number from the 33,000 10 years ago all the way down to the 4,000 and across all 5 boroughs. But we're still leading in the 11,000, active evictions.
Commissioner DeBarra?
So this could be for either one or two of you. So you were talking about creating affordable housing for income levels based on the AMI that is at, I think you said 40%, below 40%?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is it feasible to be able, and how can we do it in terms of when we look at how to make the numbers work for developments, and especially in our communities and stuff like that? We definitely need the affordable housing. We want to keep people, in New York City, and a lot of us do not make above, certain AMI levels. But when it comes to development, do you have thoughts on how, especially in the terms of the charter, how we can do that on scale throughout the city in a way that that we can actually do the building, have it make sense financially, because there's a lot of cost to it, and make it sustainable, and also is there room for mixed income development to happen in communities throughout the city, which also delivers on those AMI levels that you said?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really grateful for that question, because I think a lot of the times I think we're creatures of habit just innately, and it feels more comfortable to stick around to what has been going on, even when we figure out that it's ineffective. So historically, how the AMI has worked, particularly for Bronxites, and I'm advocating for Bronxites because I am a Bronxite, okay? Shout out to the Bronx. We're in the Bronx tonight, so a shout out to the Bronx, okay? We have not considered that AMI is inappropriately reflecting incomes that don't exist, right? So the average median income as it priorly stood for our particular area included communities who are upwards 250,000, 300,000 a year in income, standing next to folks who are making 17,000 to 20,000 a year in income, which is the neighborhood that you all are sitting in right now, where people are choosing between food and rent. And the adjustment in the AMI, for the percentage of the AMI where we're building at, has to make sense not only for the tenants, the Bronxites, but it also needs to make sense, obviously, for the people who are building, right? Let's not ignore that fact. So some of the things that I believe also address making it make sense for all parties is to create multi-use dwellings. First of all, if we're creating something that's 100% affordable, this is like saying, do we have any swimmers? Do you guys swim? Who's a swimmer on the panel? Anybody swim? You guys are not swimmers? You don't want to swim? You ain't never swam? All right, so if you don't know how to swim, my question is, how do we learn how to swim? It's by being near other swimmers. And so what has been happening historically is that folks come into our communities because there is a low voter turnout and it is a food desert and the healthcare system is impacted by all of those different things, and there's rentership and not ownership, and they clump all of the non-swimmers together as non-swimmers and nobody learns how to swim. Right? But if we think and we reimagine what affordable housing looks like moving forward, we're thinking mixed use. We're thinking commercial space that helps sustain building. We're thinking percentage of affordable housing, a percentage of market rate, so that people actually have an opportunity to maybe learn the things that they didn't learn that also pull us up by the quote unquote bootstraps, I guess. But to more specifically answer the question, I think that we need to move away from models that are 100% anything, because that doesn't help the community as a whole when we're still in the same community together. Did that answer the question? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank the panel, I appreciate you. All right, we're going to begin moving to public testimony. We're going to do it in panels of 3. So I'm going to ask for forgiveness in advance. If I mispronounce your names, please correct me when you come up. So the first 3 panelists are Hadariah Morgan, Maria Forbes, Shaka Aziz. We're going to ask you to please keep your testimony to 3 minutes each. We're going to hold you to that. And then we will open up to panel. We'll open up the questions from the panel if there are any. And just so you're ready, after Hadariah Morgan, Maria Forbes, and Shaka Aziz, the next panel will be Roxanne Delgado, David Gelman, and Erica Keller. Sure, you can bring it up. Thank you so much. Please begin.
Hello. Oh, good evening. I almost thought I was going to miss this testimony, but good evening to the panel. Thank you for having me here. My name is Maria Forbes. I got a lengthy description of myself, and you'll understand why. I'm the first Public Housing Authority Tenant Association president that has a seat at the table for the United Nations. So I've done the SDGs to understand when you say how long it takes to get something with this Housing and Land Committee done. Imagine planning from 2016 to 2030, and then saying you're planning from 2022 to 2050. This is how long it's taking us to arrive at something, because housing is a human right by the federal law. And I'm sure that everyone in this room knows that. And while we have not reached that decision of building more affordable housing for just as well for minimum wage workers, I still don't understand that. But I have some description. I didn't come to attack anybody. I just have some descriptions of some different things. Richie Torres, before he left city council, he went to a big fire and he said, wow, people who have apartment should not have to go into the shelter. And he thought he would have been able to pass that law. And that hasn't happened for residents of the Bronx or just anyone in the city, period. We have multiple fires throughout the house. I had to stop Commissioner Carrion because, wow, he left here to go to Washington, D.C. to be the HUD secretary, and to only come back and get HPD. And I don't see that people who have fires have to go through the shelter again when the landlord takes his time to repair the apartment. The charter changed for the New York Yankees. Like, they came in under Carrion's watch and they built Yankee Stadium in 4.5 seconds in comparison to what they did down to the World Trade. It didn't make any sense to me. I'm a Public Housing Authority Tenant Association. I also sit on Bronx South District Council of Presidents as their business agent. And my national level is called the National Congress of Neighborhood Women. You can may push me off this mic, sir?
I'm sorry. 15 seconds left.
15 seconds. But please, I saw an expert. I consider myself to be an expert. Affordable housing for minimum wage families, that needs to be addressed in this new charter. Economic development and local hiring for current in this new charter. Section 3, we lost Section 3 as public housing residents, and I'm sure a lot of you know that we were entitled to any federal developments being built or anything. We were entitled as Public Housing Authority residents first. But when city council, who makes a lot of decisions for a lot of people, some of, not per se the voting, but let's just consider giving the community planning boards back some of their positions. The union land use review procedure, that needs to be addressed and speeded up, because you can't plan for 2016 and tell me plan for 2050. It just doesn't make any sense.
Thank you
And
so much.
empowering the community boards without granting the veto power has to stop, because people are taking advantage of their power.
Thank you so much
And
for your
thank you for
testimony.
allowing me to share.
Thank you so much for your
Who
testimony.
should I
Deeply
leave
appreciate
copies
it.
with?
You can bring it to the staff.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Hadaria Morgan. I serve as the COO for the Center for Urban Community Services, CUCS. Thank you, Chair Bury and members of the Commission, for providing me with the opportunity to offer to you the provider perspective and to talk with you about the vital work that CUCS does for supportive housing in the Bronx and throughout the city of New York. Throughout its 32-year history, CUCS has helped thousands of New Yorkers rise from poverty, exit homelessness, and be healthy. We provide supportive housing. We provide case management services, social services. CUCS's evidence-based model provides on-site medical, primary care, and psychiatric services, employment services, financial literacy, and empowerment services. Here in the Bronx, CUCS provides services at 5 permanent affordable housing, supportive housing residences, 4 of which we own, 3 of which we self-developed. We've developed over 350 units, which provide housing to 200 families and 165 individuals. As a pioneer of the movement, we've been adamant that our residences reflect the neighborhood. So we have mixed-use residences, families, single adults, seniors, all living within the same building. We look like the neighborhood, and we start engagement years before a shovel hits the dirt. We remain committed to supportive housing because we know what study after study has proven, that it's the most effective way to combat housing insecurity and homelessness. We support changes to the charter that actually streamline the ULURP process and procurement processes to ease the burdens faced by nonprofits who build and provide affordable and supportive housing. To continue the Brown v. Board analogies, justice delayed is justice denied. Some of our most impactful projects have taken 6 to 10 years to build. In that time, building codes have changed. There have been new green standards. Energy and construction costs have increased. Carrying costs have mounted. And by the way, the cost of labor has increased. The cost of security, the cost of superintendents, the cost of porters, the cost of the vital professionals who provide these services. This affects underwriting. This affects contracting. So again, a streamlined process is incredibly important. And as another colleague mentioned, there are absolute projects that we look at in neighborhoods we know we'll never be able to build there. So we really do need you to consider these changes to the ULURP process. We also think it's really important to center the voices of those who've lived in affordable and supportive housing residences, and those who stand to benefit from the need for these services. We hope that that process prioritizes the city's need for more affordable and supportive housing units. We also second the emphasis on deep affordability, ELA income levels. And thank you for allowing me to testify. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Any questions from the panel?
I have one real quick question. Do you see anything in the charter that could be useful? And I think I'm hearing you talk about fair share. Do you think anything in the charter specifically that could be useful?
I think some of the recommendations that have been discussed that deal with a process where you're not allowing one particular member to necessarily veto the process. I've heard the suggestions about a supermajority or so forth. We, of course, will submit written testimony that can actually get more deeper into those reasons, but we support those things. We also really support an environmental impact process that really also looks at the positive impacts of supportive and affordable housing that affect safety, that affect community resources. By virtue of the fact that we provide on-site services, including the fact that CUCS provides on-site medical and on-site psychiatric, we are freeing up resources within the community. When we develop our property, when we put in our services, we are not taking from your neighborhood doctors and urgent care centers per se. We in fact actually provide many of the health services that folks need on site, right? Those benefit advocacy services, they're on site. So there's a positive benefit. We also, because of the changes in building codes, sometimes you'll be walking by our buildings not knowing what our buildings are, and we have more energy efficient buildings that deal with some of those issues that other colleagues mentioned, impacts on water use, impacts on waste use. We look to sort of site our facilities near and around public transportation, because we have to. So I think actually having an environmental review process that centers the voices of folks who need the housing, the folks who live there, and actually looks at the benefits of what it is we're doing and offering the community. Many of our developments have designated community space, as you all know. This is part of actually getting things that are negotiated with council members in terms of support. And so I think that it's important that the review process, actually take those things into account as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
so much for joining us. The next panel is Roxanne Delgado, David Gelman, and Erica Keller. And while you're coming up, is there anyone remaining who needs sign language interpretation? Is there anyone here who needs ASL? Okay. All right. So you we'll excuse this interpreter at 8. I would ask all of you to come up, both Roxanne, David, and Erica, to come to the table at once. Thank you so much.
Evening, Commissioner. Roxanne Delgado. I'm here to discuss what happened with 2560 rezoning in the Bronx in Community Board District 11, City Council Matter District 13. The Community Board 11 had from November 2, 2022 to January 3rd, 2023 to review and vote on this matter. In fact, they did not. They voted on it on Feb 23rd, and they did not provide city planning their advisory vote till March till after March. By then, both the Bronx Borough President voted in favor of this rezoning, and the city plan already held its public hearing on March 9th. So the fact that Community Board 11 was 2 months late was a disservice to our community, which is why I recommend that there's a joint hearing between the BP's office and the Community Board to ensure deadlines are met, to ensure there's more public output, because the BP's office held it during Thursday at 10 a.m. when most of us work at 161st Street, which is out of our way. These public joint hearings should be held at the proposed site within a 1-2 mile radius and not during normal non-working hours. So that will provide more public input and more awareness, and deadlines will be met. My second issue is, besides the lack of Community Board abiding by the YOLO process and no accountability and no public output, is the fact that city planning. I have a lot of issues with city planning because, unfortunately, it's not being run by the master of field. It's being run by an ex-politician who actually was very disrespectful of people who were not in proposal of this project because they assumed we're all YIMBYs. Well, I realized I am a victim of Ida. I used to live in a private house basement, which was flooded. They don't understand the higher density they built in communities, and I live in a community of color, Palm Parkway. I am a person of color. it puts a lot of burden on infrastructure, overcrowded schools, more trash, flooding. So to continue building with these, and us mentioning infrastructure doesn't mean that we're racist, we're yimbys. And regarding my former councilmember, Marjorie Velasquez, her narrative is not fully true because even though I don't live in Bronx, those people were very upset because she campaigned, and to the day before the vote, she adamantly told them she was against that project. And the following morning, some kind of deal was made where she reversed her vote at the last second. And most people don't like to be lied to. Now, death threats are unjustifiable. There's no excuse for any death threats. But there were threats made to her that she was going to be voted out. That's why city council have to be the local representative in your process, because if they don't abide what they campaign on, if they don't abide to the community interests, they have to be voted out. The BP's office represents the whole Bronx, and there's different voting blocks in the Bronx. More people have more influence, so it'd be neighborhood pits against neighborhood. And lastly, the racial equity report was unfair for 2560 because that district had the highest displacement rate per city planning map. It was pure purple, but the racial equity report only covered Community Board 11, which include Pelham Gardens, Morris Park, Indian Village, which have $1 million homes, which increase the area of median income, and they have less renters as opposed to that site in 2560, where I live barely 0.5 miles radius, which has the highest rate displacement. So by approving that rezoning, which I'm not a YIMBY, I'm not an NIMBY, is because it's going to bear not only a burden on our infrastructure, it's going to displace us because 7% of those people are non-English speaker renters, and in fact, they have no rental protection. They don't live in rent-stabilized apartment, but the landlord could say, this building is renting $2,000 for one studio. I could rent that same amount, or maybe $200 less, so you're out and you have no recourse.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I appreciate it.
I don't know how to show this. No, it's all right.
Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is David Gelman. I am a Bronx Community District 8 resident, a board member, and the budget chair. Though I don't speak here on behalf of the board, whose district is about a half mile northwest of where we are right now, my comments are representative of our board's resolution and debate, as well as the majority of the community boards across the city. City of Yes is the closest analog for me to comment on here. So while we are not opposed to the increased density put forward by City of Yes, it, one, tends to favor opportunities for developers to increase density without necessarily any material increase in affordable housing or any at all. Two, it is not properly concentrated immediately around well-suited mass transit. And three, while the concept of accessory dwelling units, ADUs, suggests a backyard outbuilding for grandma, there are no residential requirements after the original owner. So in reality, it will become a vehicle for quick turnover, non-residing investors, and thus become a significant force for blockbusting, not unlike the 1970s. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Greetings, Chairperson Barry, and to the Charter Commission. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. My name is Erica Keller. I'm the managing member of Brisa Builders Development, a company formed in 2016 to develop affordable housing, 100% mixed use, specifically with faith-based organizations and nonprofit organizations, grassroots organizations. And so this evening, I'd like to speak specifically on chapters 8 and 9 regarding the ULURP process. And I believe that there should be a fast track, so to say, or a special process for projects that are proposing 100% affordability or supportive housing. And I want to define 100% affordability in that, from our perspective, 165% of the AMI in New York City defines affordability. So all the way down to shelter rents to 165 is technically affordability. And as I think it was Ms. Abby was speaking to the fact that when you have non-swimmers all together, you will just produce non-swimmers, right? And we are in New York City where there is such diversity in range and color, religion, economics, it's important to recognize, because we are skewed so high, that affordability should really be open to various incomes and various backgrounds. And so if there is a focus on those developments that are proposing any of the term sheets from HPD or HCR that fast tracks the ULURP process, where on the front end, if they are defined as meeting the housing goals that have been established, then you have a city that is supporting what the agencies are saying are the supported or the needs of the community based on what has been established by the data. So if you say that the projects who are 100% supportive, again, meaning a varied definition for that in terms of what the city and the state define as such, and you have those identified, they go through the certification process where you are looking at what are the mitigants, what are the impacts that they're going to have on the community. And for those that are 5 or less, there is then a specific track that they're going towards that's fast-tracked, where there is community input, right? You have the council member and the borough president and the community involved, but it's more of a conversation and informative because you've already established that this project is going to support the stated needs of the overall city or the agencies in a whole. So therefore, it doesn't get boiled down to, is there 18 parking spaces or 12 or 5, but more about how is this going to support or advance the overall stated goals and what changes do we need to make in order to make it happen.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions for the panel?
A quick question. Thank you all for your testimony, and thank you, Erica, for being there. And thank you for talking about the wide range of affordability, because we could very quickly not have the opportunity for those who start to move from the lower echelon to start to move up to other opportunities if we don't have the right type of broad-based housing that's reflective of the community. I'm going to ask you a question as it relates to ULURP, and I like your suggestions. Thank you to take them into consideration. But with some of the faith-based, right? Properties that are developed, many times the faith-based organization actually has the property available, right? So they don't have to go through a process of acquisition or anything like that. So we are looking for potentially a quicker response. What are some of the particular things? You mentioned the fast track, but are there other issues? Someone here earlier was talking about historic designations, which I know a lot of churches have faced in order to move forward. Are there some other particular things that you think could help in those type of developments?
Definitely. So most faith-based organizations are in M1 zones because that is an allowable use. So house of worship is an allowable use in an M1 zone. And so I think if there was some consideration, so M1 only allows for transient housing, and in some instances that could be defined as student housing or shelter. I think if there was some consideration to have an amendment where churches who are interested in providing affordable housing, that there is, again, a different track that they're going to put forth their property for consideration for changes to an M1 to allow for residential use. Also, there's what they call the Cornell Doctrine, which has been utilized by some organizations. And so I think that there should be an opportunity for churches to use that doctrine as well if they're providing housing that supports the stated housing goals, where, if they meet those 4 benchmarks, then you're going through a BSA review as opposed to a full ULURP process.
Erica, are you familiar with the faith-based Affordable Housing Act that's been introduced in the legislature, which would do exactly what you're talking about?
I've heard a little bit about it, but I'm not
Cunningham
sure.
in the Assembly, Gennardis in the Senate. So
Okay.
you should support it.
That's definitely.
Any other questions for the panel?
Erica, and thanks everyone for your testimony, but Erica, can you talk a little bit about, Kirk was mentioning some of the costs and time involved in entitlements, And in previous panels, we've heard people talk about how, changing ULURP to fast track projects is only going to help developers and all, that's a bad thing. And I see you all shaking your head. But folks don't often recognize that often helps bigger developers with bigger balance sheets and really puts at a disadvantage smaller emerging developers. So can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you've faced in trying to entitle projects and just that difference between these big developers and folks that are trying to build a business from an emerging state?
So I always say jokingly, but seriously, that when I get to the pearly gates, I don't have to worry because I have developed hundreds of units, really basically for free, right? And I'm bearing the risk as a city, but because I am a smaller developer, I have to take out loans to bridge. And then oftentimes the interest is not incurred, or if there's a partnership and my partner is charging me interest, that's not included. So therefore, when I get to the finish line and I finally get paid, I have to pay that money back out, right? And most times the interest is not included in the reimbursables. It comes out of whatever pay that I would have made. So I have literally done much of this because I'm passionate and I love the communities that I have been involved in as a native New Yorker for the last 54 years. So I think it is a travesty because I'm committed and I'm willing to do that. But I think it's a travesty that many businesses are not allowed the opportunity to grow and to develop and be a part of this because of the fact that projects take way too long. You have to bridge with either deals with larger partners or lenders that you end up then spending all your money back. You often feel like you are fighting against the very agencies and electeds that you are trying to bring their mission or their stated vision or their commitments to the community to fruition. And in most instances, you're bearing the weight of the community not really understanding necessarily what's happening and why, because stated missions and goals are not really transparent and clear to the community so that they can understand. So I'll give you one very specific example. I was working with a faith-based organization since 2017. It took us 3.5 years to get through the ULURP process because spot rezone is not allowed. And so DCP said to us that we had to include a nursing home that was built in the 1970s out of zone as part of our ULURP application to make it reasonable or to make it sound application. And what they didn't consider was that that nursing home also had a parking lot. And so that parking lot, once we did the studies during the certification process, would allow for almost 600 units of housing on a residential street. So here we were proposing just 83 units of housing on the church's parking lot, but now, because we were forced to include this nursing home across the street as part of the application, now that allowed for almost 600 units that caused all these issues with the technical study of what would be the implication of bringing 683 units when we were only bringing 83. And literally, I had to keep taking out loans. I had to study after study after study. I kept having to spend more money on additional studies, all to get finally to the end of the process where the council member said, there's no way in the world that I'm going to rezone that across the street and open the door for the possibility, take it out. So it was out and I was $700,000 in debt, right? And so now I'm still, have application to the state, my third time putting in an application for a 9% tax credit because it is a very competitive process and smaller developers don't have the technical support to be competitive with larger developers. And we're hoping that we are finally successful and that this church that trusted me and partnered with me in 2017 will finally be able to develop 83 units of senior housing in the founder's name, who is in a nursing home now. She's gotten dementia, and so she won't even understand that this development for the community is being named after her.
Sorry, I know we got.
Go ahead.
Okay. That last statement almost brought me to tears. So sorry about that. Is there anything specifically in, like with the charter and stuff that we could address that could sort of like mediate that could address those things and make it easier for us to bypass that?
I mean, I think that there's so many things. Like, I think that the city needs to really think long and hard and deep, and to say that if there are goals, right, that are stated by each one of the agencies, then every process needs to support that, right? That there needs to be conversation amongst the agencies and the partners that they have to make processes easier and not a fight. Like we're developing a project in Cornega, on Cornega in Far Rockaway, and Far Rockaway is saddled with structural issues, right? Because the downtown rezone did not have any conversation with DEP. And so you have developments going up left and right, but there isn't the infrastructure to support all of the new developments that are happening in downtown Far Rockaway. And so each developer is now fighting with DEP, who's trying to figure out how do we get some other agency to pay for the infrastructure that's needed to support these developments that are going. That could have been eliminated when through the EULA process that was originated by the city itself, that they had all of the commissioners sit down at the table and say, this is the 10-year plan for downtown for Rockaway. Like, what do you need to do, DEP, in order to facilitate this? What do the roads need to look like in order to facilitate this? Like, what do the schools need to look like? Like, how do we all plan so that we're not fighting each other as this is being unfolded for our constituents?
Any other questions for the panel? I want to thank you so much for your testimony, and well, all of you for your testimony. I want to thank you in particular for those stories which help elucidate the problem of the structural barrier that we're putting on top of people who are trying to do the right thing. So I want to thank you for persevering despite those challenges.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. We have one final panel. We have one final panel via Zoom. Basha Gerhardt and Michael Cates, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your names.
All right. Good evening, commissioners. Can folks hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Basha Gerhardt, and I serve as the Senior Vice President for Planning at the Real Estate Board of New York, the city's leading real estate trade association. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this evening on the challenges of building sufficient housing to address our crisis. Unfortunately, recent positive efforts, such as the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, do not change the fact that today the New York City development process is up to 3 times longer than anywhere else in the country and costs up to twice as much on a per unit basis. There are several key considerations in the build or not build decision that a developer must make before it can secure financing to start construction. In addition to determining whether a proposed project will generate enough revenue to cover the cost of construction, operations, and maintenance, the developer must conduct due diligence around zoning and tax program requirements. A developer will not choose to build if its project will not generate a sufficient return to compensate for the high risk and large upfront costs of development. nor will a lender provide the debt needed for development unless the project's revenue is sufficient to support the size of the loan. City government process has a significant role in this calculation. City agencies including DOB, FDNY, Sanitation, DEP, DOT, LPC, PDC, and Parks each have permitting authority, and a project that is as of right under zoning will nevertheless need to obtain permits from some or all of these agencies. Each of the permitting agencies has a different pathway for permit filing, review, and issuance. A related challenge is the fact that ULURP applies to all projects that require land use approval, regardless of project size or the amount of housing proposed, and without a distinction between those projects with the potential for environmental impacts. By treating modestly sized housing projects much the same as larger, more complex projects, the process adds cost and delays to smaller projects, making them financially infeasible. The Commission's proposed charter changes in the area of land use should be designed with a goal in mind of finding better ways to stimulate housing production. While the construction of affordable housing is inherently constrained by the city capital budgets, federal policy, available municipal land, and staffing levels at the relevant housing agencies, the charter alone cannot solve those issues, but it can play an important part in increasing the affordable housing pipeline by building a framework focused on increasing production. Changes to the charter should consider whether projects that vary widely in size, complexity, and in the potential for environmental issues should continue to be treated alike in the approval process. Housing projects, regardless of their size or environmental profile, are serving a citywide need. The ability of these projects to move forward should not be determined under a process that elevates local perspectives above citywide concerns. This may not require a reimagined process altogether, but instead a new determining threshold for what enters ULURP in the first place. And finally, all permitting should be predictable and time certain. Thank you to the members and staff of this commission for undertaking this necessary work, and appreciate you staying so late.
Thank you so much. If you could hold on in case there's questions, but first we'll hear from, next we'll hear from Michael Case.
Hi, my name is Michael Cass, and I'm a resident in Morris Park. First, as someone who was a constituent of former councilmember Marjorie Velasquez, I must thank her for her powerful testimony earlier. I supported the rezoning in Throgs Neck, and I can vouch for the vitriol she and others experienced. It wasn't easy, but she did the right thing for our district, because we desperately need more housing in the East Bronx. I've participated in a few ULURPs, and it's clear the process could be improved. ULURP is a very long and repetitive process, with the same small group of folks testifying at each stage. One idea worth exploring is merging the community board and borough president reviews into a single review under the borough president. The borough president already oversees the community boards to begin with, and the borough president would still be able to consider local input while balancing borough-wide needs. Using the Bronx Metro North Station area rezoning as an example, we had 3 separate community board reviews of varying quality, to say the least, while the borough president hearing and review was productive, informative, and far less adversarial. Streamline the process and let the borough president's office guide local community review with their professional land use staff. On the other end of the ULURP process, I'd like to see limits on the city council's ability to modify or disapprove land use applications during a housing emergency. Ultimately, the aim should be to limit the unwritten practice of member deference. We can streamline the rest of the process and still have this major roadblock. Too often, city council members will put politics ahead of good planning, ultimately leading to fewer units of housing being approved. We saw that with the Bronx Metro North rezoning, and we saw that with the City of Yes with some of the modifications. I understand that an informal practice like member deference is difficult to address, but the commission must try. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions for either of our panelists? Carl?
Just very briefly, thank you both for your testimony. It was very helpful. Ms. Gerhardt, will the real estate board be submitting very specific recommendations to us?
Ideally, yes. I think, as you know, the industry is a bit risk adverse, and we're listening to a number of different suggestions, taking those under advisement and, sorting through what we think will be productive in our support, while also understanding that injecting or creating a new process does introduce new risks to what is already a risky development process, especially when we start thinking about the discretionary review. One thing I would say that we have coalesced around as like a starting point is really thinking through, and I think you've heard this from several other groups, both tonight and at the hearing last month as well, is really looking at whether environmental impacts and whether there are environmental impacts, is looking at that as a screening tool for whether something goes through a full ULURP process. The 1989 charter changes were really focused more on mechanism, correct? Right. Zoning map changes must go through this full process, regardless of whether it's a extension for a supermarket or facilitating a otherwise generally as of right UDAP or HPD finance project that's 100% affordable. The 1989 charter changes didn't really distinguish between those mechanisms, between those project scales, and really focused on mechanism as the screening entity.
Thank you. Any question? Any questions? Okay. All right, thank you both so much for your testimony, and thank everyone here for being a part of this process, for staying with us, and for participating in the democratic process. It's deeply appreciated. The next public hearing of the commission will be held on Staten Island on April 9th at 5 p.m. at the Staten Island University Hospital North at 475 Seaview Avenue. And with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Any opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you so much.